Yeah, I think
I heard that.
Okay.
I have long ears.
That's actually okay, isn't it? Because then I also well, at least very recently stumbled across, if you look at now, in such a case of German, there's an extremely molecular construction you can use instead of the common erhalten common vegan means just the same thing, but it's utterly inaccurate. Use this. To obtain something by violence. Yes. And frequently is not frequently has a connotation of resistance or force.
Seems to show us. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Interesting things I never mentioned.
All right.
That's kind of strange. One interesting thing is have such truly oral transmission spanning several centuries to show that to others. Oh, is that true? Yes, it's true. Apparently it is. That goes back to okay.
Yeah, sure. Well, no one really understands what happened. So maybe you could do that, right? Like I say, it's quite difficult.
Yeah, it's a contamination.
Sure, that it could be contaminated. Yeah, it's the motivation. That's difficult to figure out. Absolutely. That's what we're
No, we're not. We're not. Oh, all right. This looks terribly, terribly. Eine allgemeine Verschwörung. Hallo.
Especially for English descriptions of 17th century.
I mean, I'm not very good at figuring this sort of thing out. Something goes. Well, I mean, I don't want to get everybody out. Yeah, okay. I think we could put that in the middle. Okay.
But I'm trying to. Hi, thank you. Hey. No. See. Different kinds of mixture actually to address the wide
You could have actually
Sorry, I walked across this campus and thought, we were here.
That's all right. I yeah, I don't. Jay, you can have an interior seat if you like. Oh, okay. Okay.
No, it's good to see you. How are you? Good. Not yet. Yes.
It felt too much like it first at the when the graduate students in the 90s.
Good to see you. How you doing?
I got it.
But it's
Yes.
You the chair.
I have a we didn't sailing.
Well, briefly, yeah. But congratulations on your
Thank you.
appointment. Have you
Thank you.
started it? Are you starting it right now? I mean,
This campus is not for the faint of heart. Oh.
Oh, the meaning of life? I don't know, you had this thing with you. You always say that.
And then, hey, look, there goes somebody. Much you think,
Have you seen that?
I'm going to call on you in my paper.
Oh, no.
For a region fact.
Okay, all right.
So,
All right, let me remember what I remember about Sturm.
Is that it's our familiar chords?
yeah, it's the last.
I'm seeing it online.
Well, this time I have to take the word because this is something that's in the form of differences.
Oh, here.
The biggest portion of well, there's no, the only 80 continuous of that, since it doesn't count. It gets things in so our concentration numbers are probably very bad. It's just back into one way. Like everyone did. This is what it said in the book. Room 1 is here, and if it's a number is here for a second, it's not just and another one had a linguistics career. Arthur Galactus. So George so was. I recall he did.
Okay, got it. Thanks.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Is there a note in the YouTube description that says that all of the...
I'll make an announcement, but if you want to put a note in there, that'd be great. Okay. Team is tomorrow. I don't have to worry about that. Let's see.
Did you see the Harvard? See Harvard map?
No. I have
Right, I know he's doing first two.
They didn't send me home magazine, they sent me endless novels of people. Please, as an Olav.
It's always happening.
Yeah, I know, but I created things, they weren't. Rather tangled.
It won't affect you. It won't affect us.
Honestly, give everybody else 5 minutes.
YouTube it says got 5 million views. I expect I did advertise it.
Sent out some notice.
Yes.
So exactly this conference
All right, so you asked me to put the Icelandic session too. That means I'm talking about speeding that particular college.
Yeah, well, that was going to be back down.
And he has not been responsible. Yeah, because
The program has changed.
The program has changed.
Yeah.
If you were going to say this German, what is it? Sturm? What is it? What is it?
We took a few minutes, right?
I think remote work exists.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's just check it out. Okay.
Can you see the image?
Yeah. Why don't you stand over there? And
And it works for both the transmitter and the recipient.
there. Good. Yeah. But I mean, people will have their hand out, right? So, yeah. Okay.
Next approach.
Yeah.
Let's see how that goes.
So we are Michael.
You can also say it's just a very aufgezeichnet. But we are historical linguists.
How are you? All right.
Well, today is Friday.
It just feels like a holiday because it's a holiday.
Yeah, there's no rush. So,
Yeah.
what's new? Oh, really? Very good.
I think our first pickoff will put something.
Oh. Well, that's been in the works for a while. So it goes. Yeah. Was a pleasure. Well, it takes some time.
There was a funny what is the honor?
Excellent. It's not so far off there.
5, 6.
Good.
Mazel tov.
Oh, you take that first semester. It took me 59 months.
Nothing wrong with being optimistic.
But when you said 3 semesters, I was immediately.
What's the list? 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14.
Yes, yes. Another two. I don't care what they offer. A likely victim.
You should try.
I'm not develop some interest and we'll see what happens. That's the only way.
That's 5 months geographic.
Yes. Let's see, we've got one right now. How many others there might be? Because I don't remember what year. I think they're good at this. Anyway, I lose track of it. But we have one right now. But it's, very occasional thing because classics, you're not allowed to take
Conference mode. Not enough.
all the different constellations.
And
So there are candidates of that kind, and ancient history, and ancient philosophy, and of course literature. And so, we're only supposed to, I think we're supposed to shoot for an intake of only about maybe 3 or 4 doses a year. Which means that we give out maybe 5 or 6 editions. So it's very
We are watching on
oh no. For some reason, some year we had only one. This year there is no minimum. They're talking about a minimum for undergrad.
Well, when I was at one
that ever happened.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the 36th East Coast Indo-European Conference at Cornell University. I'm Michael Weiss for the millions of people watching. The Department of Linguistics at Cornell University. Let's see, I have some general announcements. We're going to be live streaming this conference, so which will be available on the Cornell University YouTube channel, linguistics YouTube channel. And by the way, you can watch your recorded speech anytime you want. You can take it down if you want as well. The handouts are posted either on the Cornell University Linguistics page, those that I got in time to do that, and the rest of them are posted on my academia.edu page. I am not claiming that I wrote your papers, and I will take them down after this. That's where you can see the handouts. And the bathroom, if anybody wants to know, is right out the hall there and past the elevators that way. I guess, I have to say thanks to our sponsors, the Department of Classics and the Department of Linguistics at Cornell University, who generously funded this conference, and thanks to everybody who's made it to this remote corner of the world to attend this conference. So I will hand it off to our chair of the first session, Professor Alan Nussbaum of the Department of Classics and Linguistics at Cornell University, and this first session is actually named in honor of Franz Bopp, the founder of our discipline. Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, can get going then. Welcome to the Franz Bopp session. This is the only session with a di-syllabic eponym, which of course is pretty much the minimum for these purposes. We'll have three papers in this first session, starting with Jared Klein, University of Georgia, who will speak on discourse, articulation, and Gothic, with notes on the treatment of the same phenomenon, classical Armenian and Old Church Slavic versions. Jared.
Is this the podium?
Yes, this is the podium. This is the camera here, Jared, so you don't have to look into the camera.
Thank you. Yeah, let's just pass it down. Okay. Thank you. Gothic discourse articulation is in large measure effected by means of a system of particles. See the prologue on the handout. Common to all of these is that they are capable of linking larger discourse units of the sort that, in our Greek New Testament text, are typically associated with verse boundaries. Moreover, all but Yah are associated with what I would call dynamic discourse progression. In treating these items, it will be useful to cast a glance at the means used by the translators of the classical Armenian and Old Church Slavic versions to capture the same phenomena, thereby giving us insight into how they viewed the discourse relationships implicit in the original Greek text. In this paper, I will be able to cover only the most important features of the individual particles we will be studying. For the purposes of this contribution, I have had to satisfy myself with a base subcorpus, including all of the fragmentary Gothic Matthew as well as John chapters 5 through 8. The totality of this material constitutes approximately 20% of the gospel text, which in turn constitutes about 10% of the total Gothic biblical corpus. In most instances, however, I have needed to go beyond this subcorpus in order to obtain a reasonable sample size. Our presentation will canvass the individual articulators seen in the prologue, providing one or more characteristic employments of each. We'll start with athan. For details on the frequency, translational relationships, and etymology of athan, see handout number 1. Athan is an orthotonic conjunction signaling a range of adversative values, most characteristically and most strongly in 4 passages in Matthew 5, where Jesus, speaking to his disciples, contrasts his views of ethical behavior with those of the law of Moses. The framework for this discourse unit is in each instance the statement, quote, "You have heard that it has been said, hosne veduth thati quithan ist," followed by Jesus's, "But I say to you, athan ik quitha isvis," as in handout number 2. Notable is the use of the first-person pronoun, which underlines the strength of the opposition and its source in a language which is normally pro-drought. The classical Armenian and Old Church Slavic versions show, respectively, ayr and je. Armenian ayr is one of 2 strong adversatives in this language, the other being bites. On the other hand, Old Church Slavic je generally possesses the same range of nexal values as Greek de, and therefore is not strongly adversative. In the 3 other passages mentioned at the end of handout number 2, the Armenian text reads respectively bites, ayr, and ayr, while the Old Church Slavic text has je in all instances. Next, we'll look at if. If is the most general of all the Gothic discourse articulators, serving as a sentential nexal element conveying a range of different discourse values, from mere continuation to strongly adversative relationships. And we omit here those instances in which it functions as a contrary to fact conditional. If is the closest thing Gothic possesses to Greek de, which it renders in the overwhelming majority of its occurrences. Like de in the Greek text, it is one of the most frequent words in the Gothic Bible, appearing 626 times. Unlike quasi-enclitic de, however, discourse articulatory if is an orthotonic first position element in Gothic, as is vouched for by its etymology, Proto-Indo-European eti, which is nowhere in Indo-European enclitic. Examples showing the range of occurrence of if in discourse articulation are seen in handout number 4. In A, what follows the injunction may be interpreted as either a continuation of the first clause, an explanation for it, or a slight opposition to it. Explanation is clearly the nuance perceived by the Armenian and Old Church Slavic translators who use respectively zi and bopp, both of which are associated with causal or explanatory nexus. However, both Greek de and Gothic if are likely to signal adversative nexus with the preceding clause. Thus, in the first passage, the Greek text may be saying, "Thou shalt not commit murder," but if one commits murder, thereby disobeying the commandment, then one becomes liable for judgment. 4b follows Jesus' statement that whoever looks at a woman with lust for her has ipso facto committed adultery in his heart. There is no notable rhetorical moment in the transition from that statement to the passage quoted here. And in fact, in this case, Armenian shows no conjunction and Old Church Slavic shows the routine že. However, there is a change of subject, a very frequent concomitant of the employment of ith in Gothic. In 4c, ith is associated with the pregnant change of subject, use, ik. Although there is nothing remarkable here in either Greek or Gothic, the antithesis inherent in both of these versions is, in this case, not picked up in either the Armenian or Old Church Slavic translations. The former saying simply, yes, getem is na, I know him, and the latter, aza ivama, which means the same thing. We next turn to than. Of the three distinct values of Gothic than, two signal discourse articulation. Its role as a subordinating conjunction when will not come into play here. Both of these can be translated by English then, but they represent different values on a discourse level. The most straightforward of these is that of an adverb meaning at that time, which regularly translates Greek tota and is relatively uninteresting. The second value of than is less lexically concrete and signals discourse continuation, translating primarily de, but also un, and in our subcorpus, sometimes zero. It is only this second category that will concern us here. The discourse articulator than is invariably a second position element, limited, with few exceptions, to narrative sections of the text treated as temporally sequential. This sequential usage is not far removed from the more concrete employment of than to translate tota, but is still distinct from this usage. In our corpus, than appears either in non-finite structures, namely backgrounded participial phrases and adverbial phrases, or in finite verbal clauses. Examples are seen in handout number 6. 6a begins a new chapter, where tight nexus with the preceding, which says, for he was teaching them like one having authority and not like the scribes. Tight nexus may be ruled out here, and a reset following a discontinuity of the sort suggested by our parenthetical now then may be involved. The possibility of a temporal rendering then is not likely because the Gothic structure is a dative absolute, itself a kind of temporal designation. The Armenian text translates the Greek participle as a finite clause, using its temporal subordinating conjunction iprev, when, but peculiarly adding aior, but, even in the absence of an adversative relationship with what precedes, while the Old Church Slavic responds routinely with je, maintaining the Greek participial construction. 6b represents the beginning of a new pericope in Aland et al., 1968, matched by a new paragraph in Nestle Aland, 1979, 26th edition, marking the transition from the statement that some among the crowds wished to seize Jesus, but nobody laid hands upon him, to a completely new episode in which servants who had previously been sent by the priest to observe Jesus now came back and reported what they had found. We are not dealing here with internal but external nexus. That is a break in the discourse. It is precisely this quote-unquote reset which we have tried to capture once again by our rendition, Now Then. Armenian treats the transition as additive, yev, while Old Church Slavic has its usual non-specific gen. We now turn to new. New appears 229 times in the Gothic corpus, translating in nearly all its occurrences Greek nun, arti, and un. Of these, the first two renditions, nun and arti, are not of interest to us because they represent a simple temporal adverb meaning just now. It is rather the instances where nu translates un that serve as discourse articulators. All of these passages occur in speech and none in narrative. Nu has in these instances acquired an interpersonal value in which the concrete lexical notion now has been converted to a cooperative discourse value, a way of saying to a hearer, if you have followed what I have said in my discourse to this point, we can proceed further. With only two exceptions, nu appears in conditional clauses, indefinite and universal relative clauses, questions, imperatives, and prescriptive subjunctives. It is with only three exceptions matched by Old Church Slavic ubo, while the most frequent Armenian equivalent is ard, which is a weak then, often preceded by isk, a de-like weak adversative. Neither of these is equivalent to a concrete temporal adverb. One of the most enlightening sequences for illustrating the role of nu is seen in the Sadducees' questioning of Jesus concerning the resurrection. They begin by rehearsing the law of Moses concerning the institution of the levirate marriage, apropos of which they provide a hypothetical case involving 7 brothers who sequentially die after the first had married a woman. They begin and end their case with a nu clause. The first and last of these verses are provided in handout number 8A and B, respectively. A is one of the 2 passages in which nu appears in a main clause that is not a question and does not contain an imperative or prescriptive subjunctive. It is clearly signaling that the statement of the Mosaic law that precedes is a basis for what is to follow. Verses 30 to 32 relate the deaths of the other 6 brothers one by one. But having set forth this narrative, the verse cited in B takes it as a basis for the question it asks. In this case, we do find nu in the familiar setting of a question. The discourse value of nu in both A and B is absolutely typical, and in each instance, Armenian and Old Church Slavic respond in an unmarked way with ard and ubo, respectively. We now turn to u. Having discussed this articulator at great length in Klein and Condon 1993, I will say here only that the hallmark of u is sequence, both anaphoric and iterative, as seen in handout numbers 10A through C. The absence of any Greek item corresponding to u in one half of its occurrences speaks to its status as an independent idiomatic feature of Gothic. The Old Church Slavic and Armenian versions, too, show nothing matching the Gothic form. Notice that in B there are 2 sequences, sumah, sumah, and a sequence involving quathon that spans both verses. In its final member, ith signals pure conjunction and signals sequence. We turn now to tharu, thanu, and than. I have discussed these articulators at some length in Klein 1994, where I noted that synchronically these need to be distinguished from simplex u. Tharu and thanu are discourse continuative foregrounding markers as seen in 12AB. They are isofunctional if we remove 20 occurrences of thanu, 16 of which occur in Matthew, where this particle translates Greek tota, and therefore it can be considered to be synonymous with than in its temporal adverbial value. Their function in the Gospels is to indicate narrative continuity along the timeline of the main story, almost exclusively in association with a change of grammatical subject, and particularly in the case of conversational turn-taking with a change of speaker. In this role, they show an identical range of correspondences with the Greek. Compare handout number 11AB. Significantly more frequent and broader in its discourse articulatory value is than, which appears equally in discourse continuative sequential value as a foregrounding and a backgrounding marker. Both of these values are seen in handout number 13. The first occurrence of the articulator signals background information, whereas the second carries the storyline forward. In each instance, Armenian responds with yev and Old Church Slavic with je. The development of a backgrounding function in at least half its usage is the chief reason for treating than as a unitary linguistic sign independent of its constituents, and is to be imputed to a grammaticalization which has partially affected this collocation. We turn now to awk. Awk belongs to a set of conjunctions of wide cross-linguistic occurrence, which may be termed semi-subordinating. It regularly translates Greek gar, which has the same status, and is opposed to unte, which is in all regards a full causal subordinating conjunction. Clauses marked by awk can be translated almost universally by for, but often the real sense is better captured by indeed or even moreover. Their purpose being not so much to provide a direct rationale for a statement or action, as is normally the case with unte, because, but rather to provide further discursive or expository relevant information. Understanding this to be the value of awk both brings it more in line with that of German auch, Old English ek, and Old Icelandic auk, and supports its etymological source as an imperative to the Proto-Indo-European augmentation root helg. Awk functions as much in the interstices of clausal connection as it does on the level of discourse nexus. Examples are provided in handout number 15. In the first of these passages, it would be absurd to claim that Jesus is telling his followers not to worry about their basic needs because the Gentiles do this. Rather, the awk clause provides additional information relevant to his recommendation, the real rationale for which must, of course, be that God will take care of their needs. 15b provides a textbook example of the difference between Gothic unte and awk. Here, the first clause really does provide a rationale for why Jesus' followers would have loved him if they loved their Father, for he has come forth from the Father. But the second clause provides further confirmation of the earlier statement. The Armenian translator has seen this clause in this light, for he translates the nexus as additive, literally, and it is not the case that Yevoch Yeter, I have come from myself at all, inch. Finally, we turn to Yah. There is no controversy surrounding the employment of this item, which regularly translates Greek kai and serves as the most basic conjunction and at all levels of syntactic structure, from the word to the phrase to the clause. It is only in this last role that Yah may be considered a discourse articulator, as it were, incidentally. The evidence shows that Yah is, like kai, an unmarked orthotonic conjunction appearing in sentence initial position in instances where the text means to convey simple additive nexus without any other nuance. Such nexus may be present in the individual verses of a continuous story or in rhetorically parallel sentential structures spanning 2 or more verses. Thus, Yah differs from ith in not signaling any degree of adversative nexus or change of subject, and from in not signaling sequence per se. In addition, it differs from nu in signaling no interpersonal cooperative value, and from than in not signaling sequential continuation. Hence, Yah is not a marker of discourse movement, but of status conjunction. Finally, unlike tharu, thanu, and than, Yah is not specialized as either a foregrounding or a backgrounding marker. An example ex multis illustrating the discourse articulatory value of ya is seen in handout number 17, where it is only the bolded occurrence of ya that concerns us because, as is so frequently the case, there are numerous instances of ya in this passage. So with ya, we come to the end of our investigation of discourse articulation in Gothic, or at least that aspect of it that is governed by conjunctions. There are, of course, further features of Gothic discourse articulation that are effected by means other than or in addition to conjunction. Primary among these are the employment of conjunct participles and correlation. These are topics for another study, however.
Well, I'm sure that Jared was happy to take questions and hear comments. I'll leave it to you to call on people.
Yes,
I have a question on the etymology of auk.
yes.
So you reconstructed imperative from
Yes.
auk.
Yeah.
So do you think that add was the original meaning of the root that normally means something like grow, auka, right?
Of this root,
Yeah.
this particular root, it meant incrementation in some way, which could be realized, I guess I should stand, which could be realized in the sense of strength or force, but also addition, okay? That is to say, I believe that the etymology of this is A, B, increase it, C, something like that. So in other words, it's a kind of metaphorization of the pure notion of increase in terms of size to increase in terms of textual value. And I think that's the most other etymologies I've seen of it don't seem to have the same conviction, to carry the same conviction that this does. So I think that's what's going on. It refers primarily to the notion in the world of size, okay, growth, increase in that sense, and then, as is frequently the case in texts, you have a kind of grammaticalization via metaphor, of these notions. Many spaces, compare see above, see below, when we're referring to things in a text, where essentially the spatial dimension becomes encapsulated in the text, and you can relate things that way.
I like the root etymology. I'm just not sure about factitive meaning.
About
the factitive meaning. So add, grow, but I see where you're going.
Yes.
Thank you.
Josh.
Yeah. So you mentioned that if is not a clinic, or eti is not a clinic anywhere, I don't believe this, but it's been alleged that the kogel particle in Celtic is a cliticized version of eti. Yeah. But the more general question I have is, do you know of any cases where stressed sentence initial clitics have ended up as sentence initial stressed items have ended up as clitics, or is that?
Well, it's not so much. We have like Vedic E. Okay, these things are not clitics per se, but they're quasi-clitics.
Right. I mean, it has a stress, but it's
Yeah. We have a lot of things like that all over the place. They're not clitics per se, but they act like clitics. I don't know how they're quasi. I call them quasi.
Yeah.
I think it's Josh.
Could I just ask you to repeat what you said about the two examples in 8 about new, and in particular, whether there's something funny in the Greek as well? So the translation in the Greek that I know would be way too strong for the context here. So what's driving what? I just missed what you said about the specialness of those
Okay,
examples.
so basically, my main point is to distinguish those instances where new translates tota. Those to me, for the purposes of this paper, they're not interesting. because I'd like to get at just those elements which are not as lexically concrete, okay, as then, and really refer to some kind of discourse value. So what's important here, the fact that nu is translated by un, I mean, this puts it in the category of nu that I'm interested in. That's really the point that I'm making. Because un does not mean really then in this, as tota does. Tota simply means then, period. Okay? Un is a discourse value. It means now, but it's not the now in the sense of at this time. It's the now that has a kind of, now then, something like that. Sometimes it can be inferential, there can be a range of values, but in this particular case, I believe that it's just giving this sense of now then. So they're saying, now there were 7 brothers. Okay, doesn't mean at this time, obviously, because it refers to another circumstance, but it's establishing some kind of discourse position that the speaker is taking. Okay.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's thank Jared. And we can move on to the next paper, which will be by Julia Sturm from Harvard University. And the subject is the change of w to h in Attic Greek. Handout?
Can I just also say that this handout is posted on the academia.edu page. So.
Good morning, everybody. So this talk is intended to be sort of a variation on a talk I've recently given this past fall. I tried in this talk to incorporate sort of new phonological parallels to the situation that I'm going to outline for Greek initial w becoming h. I think this adds to sort of the general evidence for my argument. So for those who have heard sort of a variation on this talk before, I hope you enjoy this new information, and for those who haven't, never mind. So. All right, so the goal of this talk is to identify or define the outcome of initial w in Attic Greek more precisely. Although we know that the majority of outcomes of initial Proto-Indo-European w are well known and unambiguous, which are typically w becoming 0, just disappearing, as is usual elsewhere in the word, initial w sometimes gives unexpected outcomes, which is also well known. It is clear through cognates and other evidence that w occasionally gives initial h, or rough breathing, or what have you. However, efforts to describe the environment in which this occurs, or the environments in which this occurs, have left gaps and apparent exceptions. These apparent exceptions have led some to conclude that whatever process is operating upon these forms could be sporadic, or some have concluded that some parts of the puzzle are valuable while others are opaque. And so I intend to propose a theory which does not invoke sporadic change or sporadic retention with a plausible phonetic mechanism for this change. So to begin with, I will address the facts of the problem, give an overview of previous scholarship on the issue. Then I'll lay out my own proposal for this phenomenon, and then I will introduce 2 phonological parallels, one in Cayuga and one in Greek itself, which will help to justify my arguments phonetically. So, the problem is briefly that it is well known, as I say, that Proto-Indo-European word initial w typically is lost in Attic Greek, as you can see from all of these examples. So you have what equals word becoming epos, verb on work becoming ergon, what equals year becoming etos, and so on. As can be seen clearly from the cognates, both Greek dialects and other languages. Oh yes, there was definitely a wa in these forms, and the retention of wa in other Greek dialects lets us know that Greek did indeed inherit initial wa in these forms. It wasn't lost somehow previously to Greek or in all forms of Greek. However, in the small collection of words, we find wa becoming ha initially. For example, we have Vespros, evening, becoming Hesperos, which clearly a wa here, as you can see from Latin and also Slavic. Westnumi, I wear, becoming Hanumi, and we can see that there was definitely also a wa here. Witor, knower, becoming Histor. Heron from Wewer, which is, I'll deal with that later. And Warwos becoming Horos. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it serves to illustrate the problem. And again, here we have good evidence for the original wa in these forms. So, as I say, my goal is to identify the environments in which this change occurs and provide the phonetic justification for this. However, to go over previous analyses, work on this problem can be sorted into two broad classes, which are those which deal mainly with the so-called historic rule, and those which take a broader approach to the question of ha from wa. And I'm going to deal with the first group first because A, it's larger, and, well, this problem is much more well known. So, the most certain thing about wa becoming ha in Attic up to this point has been known as the historic rule, which is the observation that many cases of wa becoming ha seem to precede an SC cluster, specifically an SC cluster in the second syllable of the word, or bridging the gap between the first and the second syllable of the word. So, examples for this are Vespros, as we went over earlier, becoming Hesperos, Westnumi I wear, becoming Hanumi, and Britor, Nora, becoming Histor, of course, gives the rule its name. As shown by Westnumi, the voicing specification for the consonant in these S consonant clusters does not appear to matter. We could also perhaps include in this group Hestia Hearth. There are various arguments against this, however, so maybe not. If so, if this is, maybe we could include this, maybe not. So works that primarily or exclusively discuss this environment include Discourse 1998, Sealer 1995, Nussbaum 1998, and Petrovitz 2004. All of these just kind of, they go over it in more or less detail, but they don't provide crucially phonetic justification for the change of wa to ha initially before an SC cluster. They simply just state the rule as it appears to them to occur. Additionally, Nussbaum 1998 notes that wa becoming ha can also be apparently triggered by an RH, the devoiced R, that was apparently the realization of R before it voiced this consonant. And that's gone into already in somewhere 1905, also Schweitzer, and so on and so on. And I'll deal with this further below in connection with the Histor rule, that is when I come to formulating the Histor rule, and a similar RH-related phenomenon. By this RH is, again, it's not meant any kind of aspiration or anything like that, it's just simply the devoiced R, which is the allophone of R before a voiceless consonant. These are clearly not the only ways to get H from W, however. So I'm at 2.2 now. So Kostopoulos deals mostly with the H initial forms of heron I found in Horos boundary, and so the idea here, in essence, or his idea, is that wa dissimilates to ha before another wa, and there is no phonetic justification that is given for this proposed rule. I will deal with this again further below for various reasons. I think that this is not the most likely solution to this issue. A third approach, put forth by Lejeune in 1972 and now Jotteau, argues that there was a widespread tendency towards aspiration of word initial sonorants in Greek, sort of across the board, and that this tendency towards doing that led to a variation in the speaker population between initial wa and devoiced wa, with the variation eventually being neutralized to wa in most cases, but not all. And the places where this was not neutralized are the very forms in question in this paper. So Lejeune agrees for the most part that the initial H of words such as histor is due to the following SC cluster in some way. However, he considers this environment to be a reason that the initial H variant is retained and not neutralized in favor of what becoming zero. For Lejeune and those that follow his analysis, this approach has the benefit of explaining the writing of initial rho with rough breathing, as well as through various means the obligatory rough breathing on epsilon initial words in Attic. So that's sort of the rest of the justification for this approach, but again, I am not going to argue that this is the most economical approach for the what becoming house situation. So these then are the main claims that have been made about the change of initial wa to ha. So now I'm going to move to my analysis. So my proposal is that wa to ha can be explained by a handful of interrelated rules, which I'm now going to lay out. The first is the histor rule. So the histor rule, as described above, when I was discussing other people's proposals, can be expressed thus. So by this, I mean that wa becomes devoiced and then is unrounded to h before an SC cluster, with the S in the coda of the first syllable and a consonant, some consonant, as the onset of the second. So this rule, under this rule, we can group hesperos, evening, hasturmi, tehenmi, I wear, and histor itself, and again, possibly hestia hearth, maybe not. Crucial for this analysis is that the S be in the coda of the first syllable rather than and that the following consonant be in the onset. There is one apparent counterexample that many people have cited to this, astu town. However, astu has a plus low vowel in the critical syllable, which is something that none of the other tokens has that I've discussed, and may explain the failure of this rule to work, because as we know, as many have said, vowel height is inversely correlated with duration of a vowel. So the lower a vowel is, the more time it's going to take to pronounce, and possibly the duration of the ah is just long enough to prevent misperception of devoicing on the wa, and thus to block the histor rule from occurring, perhaps. So in that case, if we are to take that as what's happening here, the histor rule should include vowel height, which is specified in the formulation of this at the footnote at the bottom of page 3. So we can move on to our C clusters, and that C should be devoiced. I didn't specify that for voicing, but I mentioned that before. So the above rule does not cover all cases of initial wa becoming initial ha, such as a worksa becoming worksai, wayward becoming heritage holiday, a wers becoming heresy do. Clearly, there's some kind of something going on in these forms, but it cannot be the histor rule as previously formulated. But these words can be covered under what I am going to call the heritage rule. This is my name for it, but as previously noted, this is not a phenomenon that is just now being pointed out by me. This is a phenomenon that has been noticed by others. However, this rule is parallel to the above rule, but deals instead with wa clusters with an R in the coda and a voiceless consonant as the onset to the following syllable. So this can be formulated thus. This is, just parallel to the one above. And again, this consonant should be specified for being unvoiced. So that an R in this position before an unvoiced consonant can be itself unvoiced is noted already, as I mentioned, in summer 1905. And Soleil, additionally, in 2002, mentions that devoiced trills can have fricative-like properties, which means that what we have here in the histor rule and the heritage rule is a change from wa to ha in the onset of a word with a voiceless fricative in coda. And so my idea here is that the fricative itself is responsible for devoicing the wa, but there's some kind of over the breathiness of this consonant is being transferred to the onset. And the coda fricative, which is produced with a forceful, turbulent airstream, is transferring aspiration or breathiness of some kind, which is then interpreted by speakers as devoicing eventually onto the wa in the onset. So that takes care of many of the cases of wa becoming ha, but not all of them. So we have to move on to the second rule that I'm proposing, which is devoicing caused by R adjacency. So I'm at section 4 now. So as I stated previously, Kostopoulos is proposing that the initial h of Heron I found and Horos boundary are a result of dissimilation, which is that is that the initial wa has devoiced to dissimilate from the following voiced wa in these words. So it, however, is not clear why a wa would dissimilate from the following wa by simply becoming voiceless, since voice is not one of the parameters along which segments commonly dissimilate. This is known from, for example, Ahala 1981. It's also not clear why wa would directly dissimilate to a ha rather than just disappearing or turning into some other kind of glide or something. In my opinion, a better explanation, and one that is more phonetically plausible, is necessary. So I'm arguing that the initial ha in these words is due to the adjacency of the internal wa to the trill ra. As we can see in where wa becoming heron, the second wa is adjacent to an r, and similarly for the second one in horos from woros. The transition from the trill to the approximate wa, if imperfectly executed, could result in a small amount of turbulent air being released along with the wa, creating a breathy or devoiced approximate. It's well known that trills are pretty difficult, well, not super difficult, obviously, to pronounce, but you need the air pressure that you need has to be between like a very sort of small window. Otherwise, the production of the trill will fail, and you'll get, for example, a fricative pronunciation or a stop pronunciation or something like that. And so the idea is that from the transition from a wa to a ra, there's some type of breathiness leaking onto the wa. However, in order to derive the forms that we began by mentioning, we are not quite finished, and we will need a third rule. So herte, heron, and horos do require a further step, which is the devoicing of the internal wa, and then spreading to the initial wa. So for this to occur, I'm just positing the voicing assimilation rule, which is seen below in the derivation of herte. So as we can see here, in the second syllable, the internal wa is devoicing because of the voiceless R coda, and then the initial one is devoicing by assimilation to that. So, I have a few phonological parallels for this, one of which is of sort of local interest, which is Cayuga, a northern Iroquoian language native to this area, which is a pretty clear non-Greek parallel to the Greek situation. Cayuga is known for its laryngeal metathesis. In coda, Cayuga H can devoice onsets in certain syllables, which, in Cayuga, this can only occur in odd-numbered syllables, which are numbered from the left edge, but this has to do with reasons of Cayuga stress placement and is not important for this talk. If the syllable has the shape CVHC, that is, if the syllable comes before a consonant initial syllable, the onset consonant becomes aspirated and the nucleus vowel is devoiced. So we can see in this word, meaning it strikes, chimes as a clock. In the first syllable, the H is in coda, but it is realized as an aspirated consonant, and then that is devoiced. If, on the other hand, a syllable has the shape CVHV, which is if a syllable comes before an onsetless syllable, and this is how syllabification happens in Cayuga, the nucleus vowel does not devoice, but the onset consonant is still aspirated. So in this example, my I, which is underlyingly, the third syllable is the one in question, underlyingly that H properly belongs to the end of that syllable, it is transferred to the beginning of that syllable. So Doherty 1993 analyzes these facts as resulting from the metathesis of a laryngeal node, which is present on the H or on the glottal stop, because this also happens with glottal stops. This is unfortunately not a possible analysis of the Greek situation, because in Greek, the trigger S and R remain in situ, unchanged, but we could consider the Greek phenomena to be instances of laryngeal feature spread across the syllable, rather than metathesis. But there is another similar phenomenon, which is closer to home for this talk, which is namely H migration. So a well-known fact about Greek, I'm at 6.2 now, is that an H from various sources just any H onset, which belongs etymologically to the second syllable of the word, the onset of the second syllable of the word, has a tendency to be perceived by speakers to be instead the onset of the first syllable rather than the second syllable. So the canonical example of this is isero to ihero to heroes holy. This could also maybe be seen in Westenos to peonos robe. And in both of these we can see that the H here comes from originally an S onset of the second syllable of the word. And the crucial point here, the reason that I brought this up, is that this can be seen as part of a tendency on the part of Greek speakers to attribute just sort of extra aspiration or breathiness in a syllable that is internal to the leftmost edge of the word, rather than to the coda of that word or to an internal syllable onset. So I was thinking that the rules that I have above outlined, I'm going to sum up in a moment, could be seen as part of this tendency of Greek speakers to attribute breathiness to the left edge rather than to something going on internally. That is, this is not to say that what I've spoken of earlier, the histor rule and so on, are in themselves examples of H migration, because again, the trigger segments remain in situ. It's just that it could be interpreted as just sort of a tendency on the part of the speakers to want to attribute aspiration to the left edge, or breathiness to the left edge. So, in summary, I am claiming that there are two processes that can regularly create ha from initial wa in Greek, which are what I've combined into the histor herite rule, which highlights the importance of the coda position of the D voiced R and S, and specifies a vowel height for the syllable, and a rule that devoices wa adjacent to an R. And the assimilation rule that I'm claiming for the spread of devoicing wa to wa earlier in the word is the same for both cases. So in my view, this approach has several advantages over the approaches that I discussed in 2. The rule of R adjacency and the herite rule share a phonetic mechanism in part. Both of them are relying on extra breathiness that from this R, either a devoiced one or not. The unusual properties of trills and the difficulty concerned with pronouncing them. So the unification of the histor and herite rules, or if you would prefer the expansion of the histor rule to include devoiced R in coda, highlights the very similar environments that we're dealing with here and the role of coda fricatives in transferring aspiration to the onset wa. And finally, it seems to me to be much more natural and economical to assume wa to ha by regular rules rather than by some kind of sporadic semi-conditioned retention is posited by original. Finally, I just wanted to make a small note. My use of wa with a little aspirated H-looking thing, superscript H throughout, does not imply any particular phonetic pronunciation. So for this to work, speakers could have perceived devoicing on this wa through several means. Some type of pre-aspiration, which is used very loosely. That is some type of breathy element before this wa, or a truly devoiced wa, which could be written either several ways, or some other articulation. But what is important is that there be some kind of breathiness on this wa, which can be attributed by speakers as devoicing, which can then be debuccalized to this H. So I guess what follows are some lightly scrambled references, and thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Yeah. You can call.
On page 3, you talk about somebody mentioning that English may have particular-like properties.
Yeah.
There's a more recent article by Olav and Slavic from 2010.
Okay.
In a line called Turbulent Sounds, where they talk about this being the expected outcome.
Great. Okay.
And they also have a lot of other stuff. It's a pretty long survey article that would be point on for you. Support a lot of what you just said.
It seems to me that H migration, so-called, could actually be feature spread as well.
Okay.
To judge from ha-mes, we, and ha-nei, of bridle or reins, where you need the H to lengthen vowel, as well as appearing. And in that case, the parallel is even closer.
Yeah.
And this could be the same rule. simply applying without the W.
That's a good point.
I think that tends to support what you've said.
Yeah. I like that.
And then in this lexical family, of course, there's hema, garment.
Yeah.
Also,
Also.
sure, both
Mhm.
lengthens and
That's true.
the other thing along those lines, though, is that I think it might be a bit tricky to be sure that enemy really shows anything here.
Okay.
Because first of all, I mean, it's just the lematization, after all, of a really large lexical family.
That's true.
And this particular present is clearly secondary.
Yeah.
Right? It's basically derived from the heirs, as all of those things are. It's really no different from kara, sa, kira, and so forth. Right? The double N, general N, and even an attic shows that this was not an old treatment of inheritance. And in fact, I think Slavic Ionic actually shows what you expect there. New forms, which again would show the same as the hema, except of course it's Slavic islands to see that. Furthermore, I believe it's the case that the old athematic deponent present is still preserved, although it's usually labeled as a kind of, this bizarre perfect, that same Hackstein and whatnot, is still there. And so you could even say that this whole, this enemy ultimately, of course, just gets its age from the historical.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course it did. It's a good point. I didn't want to, I mean, I guess I still am not sure whether, if you want to discount that example, if you could have the second consonant in this cluster be voiced or not.
Yeah, well, it's a good question, but I don't think enemy
Yeah.
bears on it.
Farther down on page 3, with respect to the stubborn counter-example philosophy, I think that this is phonetic is quite possible for what it's worth, since the area boss, the area force that he was, seemed to suggest that you had perhaps an original acrostatic paradigm. Like the loss, if that alternation survives, it's pretty weak, and certainly with a low and contractually long vowel, but you would expect even more resistance to that kind of spread.
Yeah.
And so that would strengthen this kind of explanation for why
Thank you very much. I have just a marginal point in page 5 to north road and so on.
Okay, yes.
This is about the displacement of the initial, yeah. Because you have actually in Mycenaean way A to no.
Yeah.
This could help you for the chronology.
Yeah.
And also the question is what is about the initial syllable. That you have a woe or woe, obviously.
I should have, maybe brought in some Mycenaean here for that.
The intervocalic RWWR sequence is kind of the hardest part of the story, right? Because you're in a totally voiced environment. So what you want, and I think part of what you said is the right thing to say, you want something to be masking those voicing cues. And the kind of easiest thing to get is exactly what you say, but I want to give you another argument you maybe use to support it. So what you want to say is, in order to get those trills to trill, you got to open your glottis really wide so that there'll be strong airflow coming up from your lungs. When you open your glottis really wide, it's hard to continue voicing. The other thing that helps you is if you round that R before that W, the lips are round, you have a very narrow channel.
Yeah.
And so it takes even more air pressure to get that air out of your mouth through the alveolar opening, right? Because you're putting it through a funny little tube, your rounded lips. Like those two things together might be sufficient, but they might not. Some Ohara-esque experimentation in the lab might be helpful.
questions?
Oh, yes, a quick one with the Herorte stuff.
Yes.
Do you run afoul of Grassland at all, or is relative chronology on your side?
Yeah,
If we know what the relative chronology of Grassland is.
I am. Yeah, I'm not really qualified on that, but I think it's okay. I don't know. I mean, what are your
I don't have a view on it.
feelings
I
about
just
this?
know it's kind of thorny. And,
Yeah.
it seems like there's the possibility that you might just want to make sure that you're safe in that regard.
Yeah.
But I haven't.
Yeah. I mean. So.
If Grassman is early enough, and if this is late enough, you're probably okay.
Yeah.
But you
Well,
don't really
that's
know how
kind of
big
what I was
Grassman
thinking.
is. And potentially, if this story is right, it might actually give us leverage in the question of when Grassman
Yeah, I mean.
if I can reduce these dialects.
Also true. Yeah.
No further questions?
All right, the final paper in this beginning session is by Haraldur Bernharðsson, University of Iceland, and he'll speak on from Old Icelandic hefir to hefur, changes in the present indicative of the verb hafa, have. There should be plenty of comments. Yeah. So my slides are on the handout, so you have a choice between following me on the handout or on the screen. Okay? All right, but there should be sufficient number of handouts, I hope. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about a change in Old Icelandic, whereby the classical Old Icelandic paradigm in the present indicative active singular of the verb have was replaced. So in the history of the Icelandic language, there are essentially four different paradigms in the singular for the verb to have. There is the A paradigm, have, which is attested very fragmentarily through a few scattered examples in the very earliest texts and a handful in poetry. But pattern B, have it, this is the classical Old Icelandic / Old Norse paradigm that you see. It's practically universal, apart from these handful of these examples. This paradigm, the B paradigm, was universal all the way up to the end of the 15th century when it was replaced by this paradigm, C, hefur, and then ultimately by hefur, which is the modern paradigm. So the question is essentially, why was this classical Old Icelandic paradigm replaced in this way? And secondly, why did that happen exactly at this moment in time, namely in the 15th or 16th century? Now, if we look at classical Old Icelandic in the 12th century, 1200, early 13th century, there are in the present indicative active, there are, you could say, 5 categories. These are the main verbs. The strong verbs look like this: gref, grefur, grefur. Here we have the ja verbs, helja, temur, temur. The ia verbs, heyra, heyri, heyrir. The O verbs, or the class 2 verbs, kalla, kalla, kalla. And the E verbs, class 3 verbs, vaki, vaki, vaki. And then we have the B paradigm of the verb to have, which of course, as we know, belongs to the E verbs. So this is sort of the landscape that we have. And it seems not implausible to assume that synchronically for the speakers and the children acquiring the language, there was a single set of endings for all of these different categories. Single set of inflectional endings attached to different stems. Again, a zero ending in the first person, followed by the ending R in the second person and third person singular, attached to different stems. Now, so why is paradigm B vulnerable? Why was it replaced? Well, there are three characteristics that we see in this inflection, right? In the B paradigm, the classical Old Icelandic paradigm. Number one, there is the root vowel E in the singular resulting from the I umlaut of A. So there is I umlaut throughout in the singular stem. In the plural stem, on the other hand, we have an alternation between A and O resulting from the U umlaut of A. Right? The third characteristic is that there is a stem final I, right? Hefir, and so forth. The I is lost in the plural before endings that begin with a vowel, but it surfaces in word final position and before the ending R. So these are the three characteristics of this paradigm, and this is a unique constellation. There is no other verb that has these characteristics. So you could say that the paradigm B of Hava is sort of morphologically isolated. If you compare it to other classes, you see a typical E verb, so class 3 verb, like vaka, to remain awake, does not have I umlaut in the singular. Okay, it lacks the first characteristic. Rather, it simply has no umlaut at all in the singular. It has alternation of A and O through U umlaut in the plural, and it has the stem final I. So it has 2 out of 3 characteristics, but it lacks the I umlaut in the singular. So Hava really doesn't fit quite into its own family, so to speak. Right? If you look at other classes, the Ya verbs, typical Ya verbs, are completely different. I mean, there is I umlaut in the singular, if applicable, but then there's also going to be I umlaut in the plural, right? And therefore, there is no A or alternation, so it's different. And in addition, there is also stem final Yod, so this appears word finally before a consonant and before the vowel A, but surfaces elsewhere. So that's quite different. The Ia verbs, the Hela type, they are also quite different. They have I umlaut in the singular, but then they also have I umlaut in the plural, and consequently there is no A or alternation, nothing of that nature. There is the stem final vowel E, which disappears before endings beginning with a vowel, but appears before R and U and so forth. So these two are quite different. Strong verbs of class 6, like the grava, the verb to dig, and many others, they have 2 out of the 3 features. Okay, so these verbs, they have I umlaut in the singular stem resulting from the I umlaut of A, exactly like the B type of Hava. These also, they all have alternation of A and O in the plural, like Hava, where the O is the result of U umlaut of A. But the strong verbs do not have stem final I, nothing of that nature. So they are different. So the bottom line, the B paradigm of Hava is morphologically isolated. Okay, it has no parallels, there's nothing to support it. Now, so what happened? There are 2 changes that occurred in the 14th, 15th, and 16th century that changed the morphological landscape, if you will. On the one, first there was U epenthesis, and following that there was a reanalysis of the boundary between stem and ending, and this dramatically changed the landscape. So let's
look at that. First, the U epenthesis. Okay, the U epenthesis or U insertion, where U was inserted before a post-consonant or R in word final position. And this started in the late 13th century, but it spread slowly with probably dialectal variation and completed until the 16th century, it seems. But this means that the ending R in the second singular and in the third singular got an epenthetic U, right? And it seems natural to assume that synchronically the speakers that analyzed the vowel, the new vowel, was part of the ending. All right. This means that these big classes like strong verbs, in the R was replaced by U. So that means that in these big classes, all the strong verbs, all the verbs across the board, the second and third singular was replaced by U, and as a consequence, R was no longer universal in the second and third person. Right? So now we have a different landscape. There are two variants. There is either U in these big classes, or there's R in the other classes. Now, it seems not too improbable to assume that synchronically for speakers and children acquiring the language, they could infer that sort of the general morphological composition of the second and third person ending was a vowel plus R. That could be across the board. That means that, so in the ia verbs, for instance, the I that previously had been regarded as stem final could be viewed as part of the ending rather than part of the stem. And similarly, in the class 3 verbs, in the baka type and those verbs, the I would become part of the ending rather than part of the stem. And thus, the hafa type follows suit. The stem final E is analyzed as part of the ending, and we have sort of a different morphological composition of these forms. So, following both the U epenthesis and this morphological reinterpretation, we have a different landscape. Okay. Now we have the endings have become ur, and here the I has become part of the ending rather than the stem. This then, and what happens then? Look, out of the three characteristics of the paradigm B of hafa, the third characteristic has disappeared. There is still the root vowel e in the singular, resulting from the I umlaut of a. There is still the a o alternation in the plural, where the rounded vowel is resulting from the u umlaut of a. But the stem final e has disappeared because the stem final e, the e vowel, has now been analyzed as part of the ending rather than part of the stem. As a result of this reinterpretation, the hafa B paradigm has become identical in structure to the strong verbs of class 6. That is to say, now both of the two categories, they have, well, the category of strong verbs in class 6 and hafa have the e vowel resulting from I umlaut of a in the singular, the a alternation in the plural. But now that the stem final vowel has been interpreted as part of the ending, they have become identical in structure. And this then paves the way for analogical extension. So children acquiring the language at this point, having learned and mastered the more prevalent strong verbs, which are much more numerous than this lonely verb here, they have acquired the plural gröven, gravid, grava with the alternation in the plural stem, the singular stem with the e vowel from I umlaut a, and to which is then added the ending ur. Then once they have met the verb hafa, höfum, hafa with the alternation of the plural, the hef with the e vowel in the singular stem. Well, it seems natural that they could infer that, well, then you would add the ending like in all the other verbs, all the strong verbs. And thus, hefir is replaced by hef. So first there is reanalysis, where the stem final e is reinterpreted as part of the ending, and then the ending is replaced by analogical extension from the strong verbs of class 6. So this is the beginning of, this is the genesis of paradigm C. Then the next natural step would be to replace the first person. Exactly the same mechanism, analogical extension from the more numerous strong class 6 verbs, replacing the first person ending I with zero. So that gives us paradigm D. So, to conclude this then, the classical Old Icelandic paradigm, the paradigm D, hefir, was replaced following two changes. There were two changes that made that possible. First, the U epenthesis that changed the landscape. Then you have a reanalysis of the boundary between stem and ending, made possible by the U epenthesis. And then you have analogical extension, whereby the loan verb hafa is sort of subsumed under the, adopts the pattern in the much more numerous strong class 6 verbs. Thank you.
Questions and comments?
Yeah. So this is entirely plausible, but I have a little question of detail.
Okay.
What's the time gap between C and D?
It's a little hard to say. There seems to be a gap. The problem is that in the sources, there are much fewer examples of the first person than of the third person. So I really don't know what to make of that. So on the one hand, it's conceivable that there really wasn't any gap, in fact, and that this is a problem of the sources, simply because there are fewer examples to build on.
Well, that's what I was angling at, because it seems to me that in that gap, if there was one, this would have been the only verb in the language, correct me if I'm wrong, of course. This would have been the only verb in the language in which the first person singular was not made by deleting the ending of the second and third.
Yeah.
Right? It's normally an ironclad rule already of Old Norse that make the first singular by zapping.
By zapping off the...
Yeah. So there would have been a phase if this is if C and D is a real gap.
I mean, if there is a real gap. To be honest,
my intuition would be they just sort of gave it the strong inflection as they did.
Yeah. Oh, that's certainly what you would expect. Yeah. Jared, you have a question? No.
I was going to ask a question relative to the. Obviously, this is a very, very, very frequent verb.
It is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the strong verb is exceedingly frequent. My question actually was going to relate to frequency of, for example, the O verbs and the A verbs at the time. I mean, what was the relative distinction in frequency between hafa and these other verbs?
Well, I mean, obviously, this one was very frequent. Yeah. I mean, that's the only way this verb could have gotten away with this sort of funny pattern. I mean, that has no support. I mean, how could the children possibly pick it up? The only way, the only explanation is that because it was so frequent.
Right.
Yeah. But then that's why it lasted. But then when this happened, I mean, the morphological landscape was different. And it could be interpreted in different ways, and then this class thing. I mean, it's important to know that the strong class 6 verbs. Some of these verbs are extremely frequent too. The verb to take, for instance, okay? The verb far, okay, to go. These are extremely frequent verbs too. So.
But the A and the O verbs were considerably, I mean, together did they exert any kind of force within the verbal paradigm at this point, or were they reduced in their constituency?
No, these were also these are also big classes, and the old verbs, of course, they're productive, but they don't have the vowel alternation that we're looking for. Okay, so, I mean, the sort of the morphophonemic cues weren't there. So that's why they really didn't impact this one as much. Yeah.
I had essentially the same question as Jay, but another angle would be, is there an author who in the same text uses both heavy and hefur?
Essentially, you're asking, so basically, yes.
So the question is, did paradigm C even exist?
Well, yeah, I mean, that is the question. Tentatively, yes, it seems to have existed. How long? It's a little hard to say.
Yeah.
But keep in mind that, yeah, you find plenty of examples of the third person, sure. Very few of the second person, and even fewer of the first person.
Right. So presumably.
So there are only, yeah, I mean, you would have to look. There are specific types of texts where you have a number of instances of the first person.
I would imagine whoever has the first person heavy at this time has lots of third persons, and you can see if they have their grammar has both.
Yeah.
Then that would indicate that C existed, and that would raise further questions as to how you actually get a stage like that.
There is an additional sort of complication in interpreting the data, because the first person frequently is immediately followed by the first person pronoun I, yeah, right? And the first person pronoun, Old Icelandic ek, I mean that ultimately became a diphthong or a sequence of yod plus short e, right? And they are frequently spelled together. So then the question, okay, so how do you how do you interpret that? I mean orthographically. I mean is it a reflection of the sort of the diphthongization or the yod that has been added onto the first person pronoun, or is it the ending? So, admittedly, it's a bit unclear.
It's probably worth a philological check, just specifically to see what exactly how strong the evidence for paradigm C is.
Yeah, absolutely agree. Yeah, because you would ideally you would see this happen.
It's enough because it's odd.
Yeah. So, yeah.
It does not affect your analysis, but I'm curious why, when you do the standard ending reanalysis and the vowel goes into the ending, is there some particular reason why you did not do that for the old verbs?
Yes, there is a reason for that. Thank you for bringing that up. I forgot to mention that. It seems like the old verbs didn't do this. It really seems like when well, anyway. Yeah, well, it seems like the old verbs probably resisted that. At least, I mean, in the modern language, it is the case that you would tend to analyze the A as part of the stem. And you can see that from the imperative and a number of other sources. So this A is different. I wish I had a clever answer for that, but that's a descriptive fact. But I'm not convinced that will affect the analysis in the end. No, I haven't. Right. No, that would be a different paper.
That's not a sentence or two that you'd like to.
Yeah. Oh, I'd be happy. Yeah. So, well, I mean, with the A, I mean, there is sort of a similar question. Was that really a paradigm? Okay? Because the examples, they are so few and far between, and it's never the case that you can look at a text, a specific text, and say, oh, this text has only these forms. That's never the case. Okay? These are either these are universal, and where these they appear, they always appear beside these. Okay? So the question is, what is this? I mean, they look like they are relic forms of something, perhaps a hybrid paradigm of those two. I mean, it seems conceivable that perhaps these two, A and B, go back to an earlier paradigm that was something like hefir, havir, that is to say, without the I umlaut in the second and third person. Something comparable to, say, for instance, Old Saxon or Old English. But we don't know. I mean, the data simply isn't there.
Can I say something?
Yes, sure.
The reason to think that A, however, was a real paradigm is that hefur and hefur have to be the locus of the island. That's the only place in any of this whole story that the I umlaut can be original.
Yeah.
Opus and opus. Whenever those go back.
Right. Well, yeah.
There's no other form there that.
Well, I mean, unless it was sort of a hybrid, like you have in
I believe in the same hybrid you do, but no,
yeah.
there isn't.
In Old Saxon, isn't it?
Habu,
havas.
They mostly have the D umlaut form, but in any case, but that wouldn't give you heavy. That would give you heavy.
Right.
Too.
Yeah, that would give you head with the I umlaut.
Right. So what I'm saying is that A has to have, that at least hefur and hefur have to be old.
Right.
If hefur and hefur are old and hef is attested, well, probably it belongs in the same synchronic system with them because that's how the language works.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying.
Right.
and heavy doesn't look like it can have any phonological source.
Right. Right. Yeah, but we just don't have the data in Norse, unfortunately. So it's very hard to say anything definitive about this. All right. Did somebody say coffee or
somebody might have?
Might have.
I said coffee.
Stop the live stream.
Everyone, can I just make a quick announcement? So, a few weeks ago, I ordered a used copy of Severini's Book of Heroes, which you all know. When it came, it turned out to have belonged to Warren Coulter. And he really worked this book. I mean, the book has notes on almost every other page. It has handwritten inserts. It's all dated. What I now think about in the European decades. So I haven't done, I'm not done going through it. I'm sort of collating it with modern scholarship. It's entirely possible that some of these ideas will have to be published to students there. But I thought I would bring the book for anyone to take a look, and maybe if you are working on numerals, it would be fun to know what going
Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, you know, it goes with the whole philological problem. Exactly the paradigm that's like in front of me. Which seems to include the whole bunch of problems. That's right.
Yeah, I'm going to be running to and fro today and tomorrow. Yeah, we can discuss percentages at a later date. I have a rough idea of how I am in that department.
I've got this stuff. I've got a real
About your instrumental. Yeah, it's good. I thought they were my instrumental. Doesn't matter. I don't know, but
That's why you were explaining. Spirit.
Probably, yeah, even because and he makes you have some coffee.
How do I switch to
Hola, hello. So maybe perverse. Part of the policy. Italian friend, yeah?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's kind of difficult also to pinpoint how exactly they end up because you have so many things of genuines. You can resort to everything. I mean, I'm very difficult. I was wondering if these can also get it's kind of rare. We just have rare.
I mean, this is right. So I really need to
You say you do have a place to live? I have not met her.
Yes. That's helpful.
Okay, yeah.
30 years old.
Yeah, well, it's the same.
She learned. But they moved Westchester, most college is
So you consider yourself good luck or minimize that.
It will only be his presentation sets on the stream, not coffee conversations. Same thing. I'll show you.
I'm gonna disconnect the microphone now.
Oh, wow. Is this a good idea? Yeah.
Oh, God. Who knows what you guys would say?
That's right. Well, let's see. Nothing salacious.
No, I can know. All of my eggs are in the basket.
That's a great fun. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yes, right.
I can do a hand.
That's how much of life they work. Yeah, right. And, you know, they must have been yeah, right. That's all it takes. Thank you.
So, the handout is still circulating. Okay. Everybody's got a handout, probably. So,
Well,
just think I can. Okay, you have an announcement.
no, just
Okay.
okay. So welcome to the second session, the Michel session. Our first speaker is Olav Hackstein of the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich on Latin negō.
Yeah. So, dear colleagues, dear audience, Indo-European etymology and applied linguistics, do they have something in common? Well, this question may come as a surprise because most of us would tend to think no, little to nothing, or even tend to think it's a rhetorical question. But in my presentation, I intend to present a case in which Indo-European etymology and applied interactional linguistics may profit from one another. Linguists have repeatedly pointed out linguistic innovation and the building site of new grammar. This idea, of course, is not entirely new. Already, handout number 1A, already Wilhelm von Humboldt expressly regarded language and grammar not as a static product, as ergon, as he termed it, but as an activity and as ongoing production, Greek energeia. Humboldt's view of 1836 of synchronic language as a dynamic system has been repeatedly taken up again. And it would be, of course, illogical and even absurd to view language change as a purely historic thing and ban it completely from the linguistic present. If we accept that the diachrony of language is made up of a concatenation of synchronic layers, and if we ban linguistic change from synchronic language and grammar, the result would be that linguistic change could just happen never and nowhere. And to the contrary, of course, language variation as an empirical fact necessitates that change occurs in the present. It's true that common wisdom prescribes never change a running system, but language doesn't conform to this rule. To the contrary, language is like a system that changes the software while running. And language usage, including language acquisition and linguistic interaction, are important interfaces. In the following, I would like to address what the Germanicist Peter Auer has thought about interactional linguistics. He has made a convincing case for the dialogue as a building site of innovative grammar. According to Auer, linguistic interaction uses the principle of projection. Dialogues provide interactional frames of utterance and response. The utterance foreshadows and grammatically configurates the response. Utterance and response cohere such that dialogical patterns can be grammaticalized into syntactic patterns. See on the handout number 1B. But the coherence of utterance and response, interestingly, can also have the opposite conserving effect. Depending on their routinization, utterance-response frames may induce morphological and syntactic freezing. In Latin, for instance, a very frequent frame would be something like a question, do you know, so-and-so, and the answer either in the affirmative or no, or in the negative, I don't know. And the negative answer, I don't know, negō, shows negation freezing, characteristically, the older form is the negation, ne, and the lexicalization of the negated verb as negō, whereas in other less frequent patterns like do you listen, answer in the affirmative, I do listen,
or in the negative, I won't listen, doesn't show the same negation freezing effect just because it's less frequent. Then I don't know. So in my paper, I will present another case study from Latin, which illustrates just the same or a similar thing. The example concerns the Latin constructions that are used to provide negative responses in dialogues. Latin doesn't have a tight set of responsive particles like English yes and no. Rather, Latin repeats preceding utterances or parts thereof to affirm and negate. It uses an echo answer system, by and large, an echo answer system. And it also uses, however, the verb negare, which is, as I intend to show, the lexicalization of an echo answering structure. But let us start by reviewing the various proposals for negare that have been made so far. Handout 2a, Latin negō negare has often been claimed to be a delocative formation, to say neck, basically. And of course it's true, delocative formations can be reconstructed for Proto-European. Some examples on the handout under 2b. For this process, either starting from adverbs or from inflected verb forms, like in Greek, the Narpan present imperative chesdi, eat, giving rise to estio, which arguably could also be such a delocative formation. And in general, languages seem frequently to draw on delocative derivations to express verbally the speech acts of denying and affirming. Under 3, in German, nein, verneinen, ja, bejahen, and so on and so forth. But an additional strategy is to use just the speech act verb to say in the affirmative or negative, as in Greek, phemi, or in the negative, euphemi. Okay, regarding the lexical base of negare as a delocative formation, there have been at least 6 proposals listed under number 4 of the handout. For A to for C, you have the combination of the negation plus a particle with a voiced aspirated velar. The problem here is that the velar of Latin negō is incompatible with Proto-European aspirate unless one hypothesizes an extra sound law according to which voiced aspirated g would yield g, as argued by Dunkel, referring to vestigium and effigies. But these latter items are better explained to have their velar analogically, and it is quite clear that an aspirated velar yields an aspirate h before e on the strength of Latin hiare, Lithuanian dioti, and so on and so forth. So that can be maintained, of course. For D, a net plus a non-aspirated velar has also been posited on the strength of negotium and other items, neg legere, negotium. But the problem is that no unequivocal attestations of neg and negi do actually exist. There are alternative explanations for the voiced G or G in negotium, neg legere, and so on and so forth. And we'll come to that in a moment. The additional proposals are summarized in 4E and 4F. Voiceless velar que or a palatal, voiceless palatal ke have also been posited. The question, of course, is where do we get the voicing in Latin negō and in negritu and in neglegere? And a suggestion under number 4G, in fact, neg might conceal an archaic allomorph of neque, which yielded neg, of course, by early apocope, but then at an early stage, further neg by final voicing, as possibly also in Proto-European apo, supo, and opi, yielding Latin ab, ob, sub. An alternative account would use the idea of syncope plus voicing assimilation, which has also been argued for and is also would also be convincing, nequedeco, yielding negedico or apodoko, abduco, or suppordevo, subdivo would also make sense, yielding an archaic allomorph which then spread to other lexical items but remained confined to an archaic layer of the Latin vocabulary. Okay, so the given explanation of Latin neg might lead us to explain Latin negō as a delocative formation to the same allomorph neg. Here, however, we are facing a gap in the reconstruction because Latin neg is not attested as a negative responsive particle. So it's not attested in the sense of no in an answer. So again, the full story of the etymology of negō remains just untold. And turning to page 3 of the handout, we can only hope that the law entitled Wiener's Law or Wiener's Law of the Libraries doesn't hold true here, according to which there are no answers, only cross-references. But indeed, well, given the number of proposed phonological theories here, the impression imposes itself, in fact, that the etymology of negō cannot be resolved on purely phonological grounds. But the good news is it's possible to make headway when taking into account the possible constructional history of negō. And there, Manu Leumann, in fact, number 6 of the handout, has made an interesting proposal in 1926. He pointed out the possibility of a sequence ne, with elision, ego, not I, not me. And he assumed that negō is an example of a verbal hypostasis descending from ne ego, not me. Unfortunately, Leumann didn't offer parallels for the assumed base expression ne ego, nor did he account for the communicational strategy behind such an expression. And in fact, Leumann's proposal was rejected and abolished altogether 3 times, in 1938 by Walter Hoffmann, in 1977 in the new edition of Leumann's Lateinische Grammatik, and in 2014 in Dunkel's particle lexicon. But I'll try to show that Leumann's proposal can be vindicated as the correct proposal. Formally, under number 7 of the handout, Leumann's account is impeccable since no additional hypotheses for the lack of aspiration or the voicing of the velar negara are needed, and what is more, there's evidence for the putative underlying expression, not me, to have arisen quite naturally in the framework of an echo answer system. If you just compare the German examples under number 8 of the handout. Do you like etymology? Mögt ihr Etymologie? Affirmative answer, ja, ich mag Etymologie. Negative answer, nein, ich nicht. Which involves topic drop, and you get a sentence answer fragment, ich nicht. And crucially, such responsive fragments could undergo routinization and lexicalization. And there's ample evidence for just this phrase: Latin non ego, neque ego, Greek uk egoge, Sanskrit naham, Old French pronunciation nenge, Middle High German nein ich, and we'll go in the next section through the evidence. Now turning to section 2 of the handout, where I, by the way, use the abbreviations Q for question, dir for directive, decl for declarative, and resp for response. And number 9, so there you see the Latin echo answer system. Audin, illum, have you seen that one? Ego vero, yeah, indeed, I did. Or 10a, poterin parti, then in the negative, neque ego, neque tu. So, negation plus personal pronoun. Non ego also occurs, but I forgo to read all these textual instances. I move now to number 11 of the handout. And in fact, a case can be made for the assumption of a reanalysis. There's an interesting textual attestation under 11a, where an echo answer ego, I did, ego, contrasts with negō, I didn't, right? This is just a case where you can play with the idea of a reanalysis of not I or not me as I deny. In ancient Greek, you find the same system, which is notoriously widespread in Plato, of course. 12 nomitses, blah 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 blah. Answer egoge, yeah, I do. And oye, uk egoge. This is extremely frequent in Plato, this structure. And in Vedic Sanskrit, you get full echo answers under 14a from the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad. Vetanutvam kapya tamantaryaminam ya imam chalokam param chalokam sarvani chabutani yontaro yamayatiti. Kapya, do you know the string? Do you know the string on which? And so forth. And the answer is Naham tam Bhagavan Vedati. No, that, my lord, I do not know, but Naham always is clause initial, and here we have an echo answer which is not truncated. It just occurs as a full lexical reflex. Moving on perhaps to 14c, you have a directive, stuhi meti, praise me. Answer, naham tvam stoshyami. No, not will I praise you. Okay, and examples can be multiplied. Moving to 15, to Middle Indic. Middle Indic, their declarative, tvam ahesu ekekam kadiku kamo siti. Your desire is to eat us one by one. Answer, naham tumhe machyam sadavate kabisami. No, not I, not will I eat you. And now moving to Old French in section 2.4, number 16 of the handout. Old French uses in affirmative and negative answers the elliptical answer format with the positive and negative interaction particle, positive o and negative nen, followed by the subject pronoun, and this has undergone lexicalization already in Old French. The 17a, he asked him, have you been born like this? Answer, naye, no, not I, not me. Or 17b, yes, this was yours, aren't you like gods? Not I, parfois, by my belief, and so on and so forth. Now moving to Middle High German, 2.5, Middle High German has the same system in 21. Then he asked, are you called Lunette? She said, Herre, ja ich. Yes, I, in brackets, am. Or 22a, Jungfraue, wilt ihr nehmen mich? Answer, Herre, nein, ich, not I. And this is extremely frequent in Middle High German. Or moving to Middle Low German, 24, a directive, sitte wat af, dismount. Ik ben mode, I'm tired. Laat me wat roven. Let me have a rest. Response, neen ik roven. Not I, forsooth. And so on and so forth. Okay, here you have the system. The preceding cross-linguistic attestations of an etymologically and functionally equatable sentence fragment consisting of the negation of the first singular pronoun confirms the sequence negō posited by Manu Leumann, and furthermore it warrants the reconstruction of an Indo-European echo answer, negō, not me, which easily lent itself to a reanalysis as a performative speech act, I herewith deny, or I herewith refuse. The reanalysis of the negation of the first person singular pronoun as a performative verb form provided the basis for deriving the Latin negare. The credibility and authenticity of the scenario is borne out further by the following facts. The assumption that Latin negō, I deny, arose by reanalysis of an echo answer fits with the fact that Latin inherited the Indo-European echo answer system. The echo answer system of Latin is shared by most other Indo-European languages and hence can be reconstructed for Proto-Indo-European. Under number 25 of the handout, you find a brief outline or sketch of the Proto-Indo-European echo answer system. The echo answer repeats in the affirmative or negative preceding polar question declarative or a directive utterance, and this utterance is mirrored lexically. The echo answer occurs either in an elaborate form as a complete or well-nigh complete mirror image of the preceding question, directive or declarative. 25a, here you have a full echo, dixin ego hac, answer hac dixisti. B, or more typically and economically in a truncated format. The truncation, however, forms certain guiding principles. B1, broad scope questions commonly prompt the echo of the finite verb, interestingly. Ein, do you claim, and 25b, do you claim that and that? Ayo, I do. But B1a, by a sub-rule, this finite verb, can be stripped of its lexical information and truncated up to the grammatical information of person and number, in that the finite verb is substituted by the personal pronoun. This is this ego vero, this notorious ego vero, non ego, and Greek ego uk ego case, right? Number 25, I boule egoge, number 25f, antifest, do you wish to contradict uk egoge? And finally, B2, narrow scope questions typically prompt the echo of nominal constituents, as in 25g, solus kenabu domi. It's almost like cleft. Is it me alone who's supposed to have had dinner at home? Non enim solus, and so on and so forth. Okay, in all three cases of this echo answer system, the echo answer tends to repeat and leave intact the salient antecedent and to drop the extra focal topic or background information. The echo answer system persists in many European languages. It's especially prominent in Celtic. For instance, in Irish 26, on digion to Gallagher, do you understand Irish? An affirmative digium, negative ni higium. I don't understand. But Welsh has gone even one step farther in grammaticalizing it into a special answer construction. And interestingly, Welsh in 27 shows also negation freezing. Then, if such a question is answered in the negative, do you know the man? Idu. Ridu, that's a positive, but the negative is what interests us. Nakidu, with negative freezing of the negation nak, as opposed to dim and the negated elaborate answer. So negation freezing occurs in echo answers, which is quite interesting. In addition to the italic continuation of the inherited echo answer system, further confirmation of negō as not me comes from peculiarities of its syntactic placement. Negō, number 28, shows a syntactic peculiarity. Negō occurs significantly more often in clause initial position than its paronyms like recuso or nolo. In Cicero, negō is preferentially placed sentence initially, while recuso and nolo tend not to occupy sentence initial position. Now come to the summary. It's possible, so the solution is quite simple. In fact, it's possible to reconstruct for Proto-European a linguistic strategy to convey a negative interactional signal by which the subject and speaker expresses denial, and this linguistic strategy uses the negation and the following subject pronoun, and it triggers a three-step development. Here on the number 29, a truncated echo answer at the start. 29a remade as Latin non ego, neque ego, lexically renewed as non ego, neque ego. Greek up egoge, Sanskrit naham, Old French nenge, Middle High German nein ich, which provides the base of Proto-Italic ne ego, which is really analyzed as I deny and gives rise to the verb form negare. So this is it by and large. Thank you for your attention. Yes, Joshua.
I have two questions. The short one, the easy one, is could you say something about the distribution of first singular negō in early texts as opposed to second and third person forms? So in effect the opposite of the question from Haraldur before. And the second one, which could get involved, but maybe it shouldn't, just in essence would be this. What are you gaining by reconstructing negō in 7 and then again in 29 for Proto-Indo-European, rather than saying, for example, that we have a slightly truncated ne plus ego in Latin or in Proto-Italic? I mean, in your 7 and 29, you silently get rid of the laryngeal at the beginning of ego. By the way, do we know that there is a laryngeal there? Let's say, okay, so if you reconstruct a laryngeal, you've gotten rid of it, which means that you have to lose the little vowel on ne before you lose the laryngeal, which may or may not be a good thing, and there are certainly counter parallels to that. I mean, there's naham, which you cite, and of course there is this collocation nehesti, where we know there's a laryngeal, where we know that that is a lexicalized statement already in Proto-Indo-European, just to judge from things like Irish. So I mean, you could say they're prosodically different, you could say they're interactionally different, but I'm just not absolutely convinced that if you're right, you need it to be right for quite as early as you say you do. Sorry, that was a bit too involved.
Yes. I mean, this chunk of the negation and the personal pronoun it was extremely frequent, and it could be contracted and occur also as uncontracted at any time repetitively. I mean, you yourself, you mentioned Nechesti. In Old High German you have Nist, which is a later formation, presumably the elided negation and weakened form of esti, right? Whereas in the Sanskrit Nasti you have the contraction. But it's difficult to tell when the contraction took place. I mean, of course, there would be evidence for the contraction already in the case of Nechesti in Proto-Indo-European, because we have Old Irish Ni, which arguably could also be Nechesti, and we have Old Church Slavic Nast, which also shows a long vowel. But in Proto-Italic, as ne-oinom shows, there also was a possibility of elision of the negation. Ne-oinom yielding noinom, nonum. So I wouldn't see that as an obstacle, actually. It's a very natural linguistic strategy, which, of course, could involve palingenesis, but palingenesis doesn't rule out inheritance. Okay. If it's a natural strategy. Yeah, thank you. And the number of negō, the frequency, the quantificational account of the paradigm of negare. Yeah, I briefly looked into that, but I guess the verb is quite. I have no idea actually. I don't remember actually what Lodge sort of the Lodge sort of paradigm there. But that is quantificationally. I don't know whether the first person singular is more frequent than the other person. Yeah,
I think that's
okay.
I mean, I think it certainly is. Which
Would be natural, of course, if it is a performative statement in the first place. Right. Mm-hmm. Yes, Ron.
Yes, thank you very much, Olav. I find this very convincing, and I would add to support that, especially negō is more common in the first person singular. On pragmatic grounds, this kind of construction is going to be more common in the first singular. You have systems like in Old French where you have this construction for all persons and numbers, and
yes, that's true.
This in Middle High German also for the third person. I was just talking to Slava about the situation in the two largest Slavic languages, and in Russian it seems possible also with things other than ya. In Polish it's pretty much only with the first singular, I think. Not that I have a native speaker confidence. And so that would, that sort of factor that pragmatically that occurs more often would favor with this kind of reanalysis.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bernard.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Ben Fortson of the University of Michigan. A cover-up, Latin amiciō.
Okay. Compounds of Latin iacchio, I throw, underwent a change whereby yod was lost before following I, as in handout 1.1. Later the yod was restored in pronunciation, but not in spelling. So what is written as abicchio, for instance, was actually pronounced abicchio, making the preverb scan heavy by position. But one compound of iacchio is said not to have undergone this yod restoration, namely amiciō, I cover or I dress, handout 1.2, whose initial syllable never scans long. This is said to have happened because amiciō was no longer transparent, and indeed this would seem to be corroborated by the fact that it belongs to a different conjugation from iacchio, fourth rather than third io, and has an entirely different perfect system. But there are some problems with this story. See handout 121. Yod lost before I and the compounds of yakio obviously must come after the weakening of E to I in medial open syllables, but that change was pretty late and apparently still spreading during the lifetimes of Nevius and Plautus, both of whom solidly attest the stem amic. The traditional account therefore demands that this verb was still amiekio deep into the 3rd century BC, and then in dizzyingly rapid fashion became amiekio, then amikio, and entirely replaced its averbo on the basis of the new stem amek, just in the nick of time to show up in contemporary authors with its conjugation switched to boot. Even if you like the idea of a turbocharged rate of change like that, an amiekio, or its predecessor, actually should not have existed in the first place, handout 122, since m-yod clusters had become n-yod sometime earlier in Latin, as in conjunx and conjuro. There is a different approach, handout 1.3, under which amikio resulted from an earlier round of syncope in Latin, whose targets included short vowels after yod, with the yod then realized by Samprasarana as short I. Under this view, amiakio went straight to amikio already in the 5th century or thereabouts. This helps us out of the chronological difficulties, but may not avoid the problem of the m-yod sequence, and suffers from 2 further issues. The 4th conjugation membership of the verb remains unexplained, a bigger problem than may appear at first, as I'll get to shortly. And furthermore, syncope of a vowel after yod with Samprasarana cannot, to my knowledge, be otherwise supported as a change within Latin itself. The putative parallel example with the other glide, W, in concutio, is not one, as it exhibits derounding of a labiovelar. But the general idea of an early syncope with Samprasarana, I think, is worth pursuing, though not something that uncontroversially happened in Latin, handout 1.4. Syncope in certain yod vowel sequences with Samprasarana is widely assumed to have happened at the early Italic level, and all things being equal, we would normally account for a 4th conjugation compound of a 3rd IO simplex as something quite old, reflecting the early Italic repartition of yayo verbs according to the prosodic weight of the base. As per the chart there, the rule was that heavy and disyllabic bases, including compounds, triggered the insertion of an anaptictic I before the yayo suffix. Subsequently, syncope reduced disyllabic iye to long I, and unexpanded ye to short I, and thus the 4th and 3rd IO conjugations were born. This paper's modest goal is to make a case for amikio reflecting a similar early Italic syncope and being another old compound of this type. Most of my airtime, however, will be taken up trying to solve several long-standing problems that this idea throws us into the midst of. Before pursuing this further, we need to quickly discuss the one other thinkable source of 4th conjugation inflection in handout 1.5, namely the possibility that amikio is an old denominative. Certainly we could set up such a thing. A prefixed root noun, amiak, meaning thing thrown around one, hence outer garment, with good morphological parallels in Latin obex and subices, could have formed the basis for a denominative amiakie. This is segmentally identical to the yayo present we'll be setting up later, so I have no phonological quibble with it. But all 4th conjugation denominatives, except for the special case of metior mensus, have 3rd and 4th principal parts in iwi or ii, itus. It would be hard to motivate a replacement of amicitus by amictus. Furthermore, amicitus should have enjoyed the support of the semantically close vestitus. A more serious theoretically possible alternative to my proposal that our devil's advocate could suggest, handout 2.1, is that amikio simply secondarily entered the 4th conjugation. But there are actually no parallels for a 3rd IO verb doing this before the late Latin period. The closest things that I know of are the 2 verbs in handouts 2.1.1 and 2.1.2, the compound form kio kire alongside simplex kiere, and ambio ambire from earlier ambeo. Aside from the fact that neither simplex is a 3rd IO verb, these are special cases in other ways. Kio kire is assumed to have a phonological explanation, namely that the internal E was syncopated in the subjunctive in compounds, accidentally producing the basis for 4th conjugation inflection. Ambio is a compound of a verb that came to look practically like a 4th conjugation verb anyway, though there are some chronological and other complications that I don't have time to go into. In handout 2.1.3, there was one regular 3rd conjugation verb, lino, linere, that came to evince 4th conjugation forms. The reason is unknown, but it is confined to a particular style and period, and is again not a good parallel to the idea about amiciō. Also likely to be irrelevant in handout 214 are the verbs namciō and winciō, often thought to be remodelings of third conjugation nasal presence, but this is not assured. It's just as likely that they are independent backformations from aorist subperfects to which the nasal had spread early, and the date of their creation is unknown. Finally, in 215, the lexica adduce two fourth conjugation verbs labeled as variants of verbs in other conjugations, condire next to condere and impetrire next to impetrare, but these are wholly separate denominative formations, again not comparable to the idea about amiciō. In passing, I wonder whether condire is an interesting old form billed to a cum-dihi, meaning an additive or the like, of the type familiar from Vedic compounds in dihi. Our devil's advocate isn't giving up easily, however, and will sternly remind us of the fact in handout 2.2, namely there are some verbs in early Latin, mostly compounds, that fluctuate between the third IO and fourth conjugations. So what if amiciō was like them initially, and then ultimately preserved only the fourth conjugation inflections? To answer this, we need to get to the bottom of what's going on with these verbs, something that should have been done long ago, but really hasn't. In handout 221, I list all the alternative fourth conjugation forms of which I am aware from the Republican period, arranged by ending. You will see a few things pretty swiftly that are summarized in handout 222. The commonest attested alternative ending by far is the passive infinitive in iri. Almost all the other forms are also morphologically passive. Many theoretically possible endings are not represented, or only barely. In particular, the statistically most frequent third singular present. And rather importantly, practically none of these variants outlasted the archaic period. This is the opposite trajectory from what our devil's advocate is suggesting for amiciō. The only exception is the infinitive or riri. We could stop there, but inquiring minds will want to know more about these forms. As per handout 223, there are two possibilities. They could have started out as fourth conjugation verbs that migrated to the third IO conjugation, or they could have been third IO verbs that secondarily took on some fourth conjugation endings before giving them up again. Though back and forth scenarios of the latter type are not generally very attractive, I think that is actually what happened. We should take our cue from the passive infinitive, the most robustly attested of these endings, and consider it in the context of infinitives and the third IO conjugation more generally, starting in handout 2241. This conjugation uniquely switched allegiances, so to speak. It was most closely allied with the fourth conjugation before the various changes to unstressed vowels that began perhaps in the 5th century and lasted into the 3rd. As you see in the chart there, until then it shared no points of contact with the regular third conjugation in any of its finite inflections. But in the course of those vowel changes, most of the present indicative endings became identical to those of the third conjugation, and so the pendulum swung the other way. Against this background, we need to recall the basic history of the passive infinitive endings, handout 2242. There were two of them, the one that gives us the archaic ending in rier, which in my view continues the Proto-Indo-European formant die, found also in Sabellic, Indo-Iranian, and elsewhere, and another in long I, originally a root noun dative in a. There were also two innovatory forms, one in re, earlier ze, that competed with and displaced rier, and one in plain ier. The root noun dative, being d-radical, handout 2243, was taken only by primary verbs, while the ancestor of rier, as I have argued elsewhere, was added to secondary verbs, typically denominatives and causatives that wound up in the long vowel conjugations. Its renewal ze, or later re, maintained that distribution. Now in the fourth conjugation, handout 2244, as you know, there were both primary yayo verbs and secondary, that is, denominative verbs. So by what we have just outlined, originally the primary verbs in the fourth conjugation took d-radical a as their passive infinitive ending, and the denominatives took irier, and I'll pronounce these endings with their attested phonologies for easiness' sake. But as we know from attested Latin, irier and its later pal iri spread to the primary verbs and ousted the shorter ending in the fourth conjugation. This had an important effect on the distribution of the shorter d-radical ending, handout 2245, best appreciated on the basis of the following tally from attested Latin. The language has way over 200 simple verbs in the regular third conjugation, but only about 18 in the third IO. I would therefore contend that because of the strong overlap between the third IO and the fourth conjugation, that, as in the earlier situation, and the now strong association of the d-radical infinitive with the regular third conjugation, the fourth conjugation infinitive ending started to encroach on the third IO. But after the vowel changes alluded to above made the third IO present indicative largely identical to that of the regular third, this was reversed, and it is the end of that development that we are witnessing in our earliest texts. Only in oriri and its compounds was the fourth conjugation infinitive never displaced. How far the spread of irier and iri went into the third IO verbs, I do not know. The data in the historical period suggests that the encroachment affected deponents most of all, handout 2246. This makes sense because passive forms of the non-deponent third IO verbs are comparatively rare in our texts. Learners would thus have been frequently exposed to their active infinitives, which were the same as those of the regular third conjugation, and reinforce the notion that the passive infinitive should agree with that conjugation as well. And note that most of the verbs with passive infinitive in E are non-deponents. By contrast, handout 2247, there would have been no such active ending in deponents, so the reanalysis that their infinitives should be of the fourth conjugation type may have been more readily available. Note also the incipient conjugational near merger between third and third IO arose in a crucial form in the active, the third singular, much earlier than in the passive, where the two conjugations, if undisturbed by analogy, remain distinct because of the lateness of the raising of E to I in medial open syllables. By the time of our text, the fourth conjugation variant infinitive was presumably an old-fashioned biform that was useful as a scansional variant in poetry. But, handout 2248, its existence had opened the road for speakers to avail themselves of additional fourth conjugation endings as variants of the third IO ones, and it is no accident that all of these also afford scansional variants for poets and share the same metrical shape as iri, or most of them share the same metrical shape. Imano is the only exception. Some crossover to the active is seen, but not much. The statistically commonest ending, the third singular in itur, as good as never varied. I assume because it was just too robust in the data learners were exposed to. Note that, contrary to many handbook treatments, the near limitation of the variant fourth conjugation forms to compounds is an epiphenomenon. Gradior is rare as a simplex, while its compounds are extremely common. Orior is also less common as a simplex than in compounds. To cap this discussion, handout 225, I have been saving one verb that really did start out as a fourth conjugation verb, but that wound up patterning like these others. This is potior, potiri. Originally a denominative that, like oriri, held on to its fourth conjugation infinitive. It also attests what may be its original fourth conjugation third singular more robustly than the others, potitor. Otherwise, it joined the third IO conjugation. I suspect it made the switch because it had a light base and did not belong to one of the well-represented semantic subclasses of fourth conjugation verbs, which house a smattering of others with light bases. Its O-vocalism may also have played a role alongside the likes of oriri, moriri, and occasional fodiri. At this point, our devil's advocate should gracefully bow out and return to the black depths from whence he came. All the arguments and evidence so far, circumstantial though some of it may be, well nigh compel us to regard amiciō as a fourth conjugation verb from the start. If then we want to claim that it goes back to a form amiake at the time of Italic anaptixis, handout 3, we need to justify that form developing to amiciō. That brings us head to head with two controversial questions. What the fate of M-yod sequences in Italic was, itself wrapped up with a couple of additional controversies, and which yod vowel sequences underwent syncope with Samprasarana. Regarding the first question, handout 3.1, since the 19th century, many have averred that sometime before anaptixis, M-yod became N-yod, because of the view that the verb wenio goes back to the same preform gwumio as Greek bino. Also adduced in support of this view is quoniam from quomiam. Scholars have gone back and forth on this for 130 years, and I hate to force you to retread a path so utterly exhausted, but a couple of important considerations have not previously been brought to bear that I think help to clarify some of this mess. We will start with wenio, handout 3.2.1. The scenario I will sketch is certainly not the only one imaginable, but seems to me the most economical. Briefly, the claim to be evaluated is that inherited gwymio became gwynio, which then became gwenio. This gwen then spread to the other principal parts and derivatives. The first new consideration is something that the 19th century didn't know about, namely the sound change discovered by Jürgen Untermann and later codified by Gerhard Meise, that syllabic nasals in initial syllables come out differently in Sabellic and Latin, as an in the former and n in the latter. That likely means the syllabic nasals remained intact until after the breakup of Proto-Italic. It follows, handout 322, that if Latin wenio went back to gwynio with syllabic n, that n was still syllabic through the Proto-Italic period. But as we shall shortly see, Latin wenio cannot go back to such a form because a gwynio would in all likelihood have produced a third io verb and not a fourth conjugation one, since gwyn is not a heavy base. However, I cannot simply assert this because there's a well-known problem with resonant final roots in the third io and fourth conjugations, handout 323. As Meillet noted long ago, the basic rule seems to be that yayo verbs to resonant final roots wind up in the fourth conjugation, but a few of them don't. I'll note in passing that this issue has sometimes gotten confused in the literature with the conjugation fluctuation we talked about earlier, but that must be kept separate. Fluctuation is found in 3 of the resonant final verbs, pario, orior, and morior, but we saw that it also affects verbs whose roots end in stops, so it has nothing to do with the resonance per se. The relevant take-home message was that the fourth conjugation variants of these verbs were not evidence that they had prehistorically been fourth conjugation verbs in any meaningful sense. I think the question of the resonant final stems can be resolved if we consider the shapes of the relevant bases when they were inherited into Italic. The easy cases, which happily constitute the great majority, are listed in handout 324. The bold-faced preforms in the second and fourth columns are what Italic should have inherited as the base to which the yayo suffix was added. The interim generalization, handout 325, is that only those where the base ended in a syllabic resonant wind up in the third io conjugation. If there was a vocalic segment before the root final resonant, the verb is in the fourth. In the interest of time, I will just skim through the rest of this page on the handout. I first provide some speculations on the reasons for this distribution, and then discuss the only 2 additional relevant verbs, Sabellic heri in 326, which fits the pattern, and Latin pario 3271 and 2, which at first might seem not to fit, but careful consideration of its historical phonology, which involves an epenthetic schwa in the first instance rather than a full vowel before the resonant, suggests a reason why it did not behave like salio and ferio and their ilk and join the fourth conjugation. So continuing with handout 329, the importance for wenio of our generalization should be clear. Working backwards, we must reconstruct its ancestor as also having had a full vocalic segment before the n at the time of anaptixis. That is, it was already gwenio. This, unfortunately, is completely ambiguous regarding the mn business that we started out with, since we can't positively exclude that its remoter ancestor was gwemio. So then, what about quoniam, handout 331? I don't think this provides good evidence for an early Italic m-yod to n-yod change either. First of all, it's hard to see this form as being terribly old, since the adverb yam is specifically Latin, and there is a well-documented change of m-yod to n-yod in Latin itself that we mentioned earlier. The problem is the disyllabic iam of quoniam, handout 332. This is usually assumed to have arisen by the general Italic anaptixis of consonant yod clusters. This is a different and later anaptixis from the weight-based one we talked about earlier. But this later anaptixis is only evidenced in Latin. Sabellic, in fact, famously got rid of the I in disyllabic I-yod vowel sequences, whether arisen by anaptixis or inherited. So one possibility is that quomiam became quoniam, and then quoniam, all in pre-Latin, or early Latin. An additional fact overlooked to my knowledge, handout 333, is that the pronominal accusative that got grammaticalized as the adverb yam was most likely disyllabic to begin with, in which case its disyllabicity in quoniam could be a holdover, and if that's the case, then the n of quoniam has to be taken as due to some other process like dissimilation, as some have suggested for other reasons. If neither wenio nor quoniam are decisive for this question, handout 3.4, At least one form that has been brought up in earlier literature appears to me pretty decisive, but does not seem to have swayed opinions very much, and that is dormio, with preserved M. And I would think redimio is good evidence against the putative change as well, since the only alternative to reconstructing imio for Proto-Italic is to take the present as backformed to redimitus, which would then have to be a possessive adjective like vestitus. Not only does this complicate matters, but I don't know of a suitable base that redimitus could have been built to. Finally, for what it's worth, note that word initial m-yod did not become n-yod, but simply lost the yod. In sum, handout 3.5, I do not think we have to worry that an early Italic amiciō would have become aniakio. So then, what about the short I in amiciō? This brings us to our final issue, namely Italic sequences of consonant plus yod plus short vowel in an open syllable. The facts are laid out in handout 4.1. The usual modern line is that any vowel could syncopate in a disyllabic I-yod vowel sequence, see the last two columns. But in monosyllabic yod vowel sequences, the only vowel that could syncopate was short E, see the top line of the first two columns. It is additionally averred, handout 4.2, that the same round of syncope zapped the vowels in all these sequences. That ought to mean that if short E could be eliminated after either yod or I plus yod, and short A could be eliminated after I plus yod, then it could also have been eliminated after yod alone. But, handout 4.3, the same reasoning would predict that short O after yod alone should be syncopatable, just like it was after I plus yod, a view rejected by the received wisdom, because the sequence yo is retained word finally in the genitive singular osio. However, handout 4.4, I am not sure that the preservation of the final O in osio rules out its syncopatability word internally. The conditions for apocope are often different from those for syncope, after all, and word final O never disappeared in any environment. By contrast, word final E did disappear in some words, even when there was no preceding yod. Not all these are of equal antiquity, of course, but note that they are all peremptory forms, or clitics, which are a well-known locus of reductions, and all the forms ending in yod plus E, or I plus yod plus E, are vocatives or imperatives, also peremptory forms. If we allowed the possibility that yo became I word internally, handout 4.5, it would greatly reduce the workload of analogy, not just for the first plurals like copimus, the form always cited in this connection, but also for the second plural middle and the other forms listed there. Cross-linguistically, compare the parallel change in Tuscan Italian in 4.6. If these developments can be admitted, then ammiakia would have become ammiakia by the early anatixis, and then syncopated to amici, leading straight into Latin with no further change. To be sure, handout 4.7.1, one might expect the I to have fallen victim to any of the various later syncopes that came along, but as is well known, those are notoriously unpredictable. And anyway, the participle amictos, which is one of the best attested forms of the verb, would have always been around as a source for the reintroduction of the vowel. The last complicating detail, handout 4.7.2, is that after the syllable we might have expected anatixis because of the resonant. That might be a genuine weakness, I will concede, but note that there is a growing body of evidence indicating that onsets contributed to syllable weight, and had no onset. We also don't know if anatixis was iterative. It may have operated once to produce ammiakia and nothing beyond that. Thank you. Sorry, I left my pen at my desk. Let me just grab it and make notes. Sasha, question?
A very minor point about condire.
I'm sorry, about which? Condire?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So it might be the case that condire has nothing to do with condere. If we believe Felix Johnson's etymology, he connected the verb for seasonal pickle with Greek panthes, gourmand. So it would be quan.
Yeah. I didn't know about that, so thanks for bringing that to my attention. Yeah, certainly possible, and it would lead to the same point overall.
derivation of the development of the Slavic nasals, which you, following Utterman, give as initial syllables, right? Is that what you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think you think that it was only absent word initial.
Right. Well, so actually, I mean, if you follow your formulation, you might have an additional argument for the derivation of wenio from full grade, because there's this Umbrian form menes, which is supposed to be from comenes, and if you follow your formulation, that would have to be a full grade, right?
Yeah. So I was initially going to talk more about the full grade forms, but just not having time. I believe. Do you still believe your analysis of menes is an old future perfect rather than a future?
Yeah.
In other words,
so, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
In other words, we have no evidence in Sabellic for what the present stem actually was, but one would sort of assume it was probably
based
done as
upon
well.
the present, yeah.
Yeah. And so Sabellic would therefore pretty much have to, assuming the Untermann-Meiser formulation is correct, right, that would have to come from a full grade and couldn't go back to the Slavic nasal. And of course there's, I guess, sort of kind of circumstantial evidence sort of arguments you can make about the fact that this allomorph Gwen had spread, everywhere in nominal derivatives and in the non-present tenses and so forth, clearly in common Italic already, and one can bring that in as additional argument. But I think it kind of cut off where you were going with your
No, I mean, that's all I was saying. But also, you could cite as a parallel these forms like entento, right, from entelmato, where they introduced the full grade from the, I guess, the root aorist, right? So
right. Yeah.
Right.
One presumes it's from the root aorist.
Yeah.
As many people have said.
But if the root aorist is involved, then of course, the third singular is a place where you can start generating things from M's anyway.
Yeah. And it doesn't really matter for what I'm saying, that's what I also believe. But I don't think you can't really prove it, I guess is what I'm saying, based on the evidence we have. But I certainly would follow that line of thinking.
Okay, we better go on. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So our last speaker this morning is Brent from UCLA. Two notes on dia and Lindeman law in Italic. And I'll just note that although a random number generated this session, they all actually turned out to go on Italic. Let's go to both sides of the table.
Okay, this is about some derivatives of the word for sky god, and its derivatives are, of course, very richly attested in Italic. There's no need, I think, for a full survey, no time anyway to do that now, but I might just survey some basic facts that will be useful. There is, first of all, a fundamental formal and semantic dichotomy for Italic, namely differentiated developments of the diphthong forms of the original paradigm, and on the other hand, the forms derived from Stang's law, which end up as long E forms, as in handout 2. So the diphthong forms mainly end up as the word for Jove or Jupiter, with some rare adverbs meaning day, whereas it's the long E forms that mainly end up as the word for day, apart from some rare nominative, vocative, and accusative forms that do mean Jove. A representative selection of the diphthong forms meaning Jove are in handout 3. There's no need to go over these. These are familiar. The vocative dieo ending up as the first part of Jupiter, and so on. And these marginally do include a few Lindeman forms or Lindeman-based forms, as in dios, ending up as dios of dios fidios. There are, as I said, a few diphthong forms meaning day, as in handout 4, but mainly it's the long E forms that have the meaning day, as in handout 5, again, as is well known, the accusative form diem, ending up as the basis for the new nominative dies in Latin, and a whole generalized stem of that type, die, as seen, for example, in the ablative singular diade, classical die, and also a form pointing to die with the glide directly after the d, as in Oscan zikolom, and similarly in the Faliscan word for today, foyed, both of those forms contrasting with die in Latin diecula and hodie. And I should say that it's the underlined forms in handout 5 that are going to be our main concern in this paper. Again, as in 6, there are some rare long E forms that do mean Jove, and we'll have occasion to return to those briefly later on in the paper. As for the distribution of the root shapes among the two types, this can be described as in handout 7. For the diphthongal forms, as we've seen, both non-Lindeman and Lindeman forms are represented. This is not in any way problematic. It's what I think we would expect. For the long E forms, though, these are almost entirely of the form die, that is, based on the Lindeman and Stanislav form, ultimately based on the accusative singular diem. So the question then becomes, what accounts for the isolated die forms in handout 5? I think this may be interesting, but it seems that it's never been, or almost never been, addressed. I should make clear that I'm assuming here a standard, what might be called a non-Leiden version of Lindeman's law. Those who follow the Leiden version of Lindeman's law, according to which so-called Lindeman forms are exclusively an Indic phenomenon, will have very different views, at least about the first problem to be discussed here, namely, as in section Roman numeral 1, Sibyllic forms pointing to diecelo, as in the Oscan form zicolo, as opposed to Latin diecula. For that Sibyllic form diecelo, besides the form zicolum already mentioned, we have another form, yiculus, nominative plural, in a more mainstream Oscan dialect that shows the treatment of the initial cluster, rather like the way it's treated in Latin. But the word is found otherwise with replacements, as in handout 9, replacements both after dio and after die, as in the forms in 9, so Oscan iokle, locative singular, basically going back to diokelo, or Umbrian dishel, from diekelo, and the Volscian theonym declune, essentially going back to the same type of form with an additional suffix. On the Latin side, Latin diecula has been adjusted after dies, including its gender, but this can still be supportive in a general way of a Proto-Italic diecelo, which Rix and others feel comfortable reconstructing, I think, correctly. So why do we have die in diecelo? Handbooks and other treatments either say nothing about die in diecelo, beside far more widespread die, or they obscure the issue using notations like the one in handout 11. I suspect that the probable but usually unexpressed assumption is that die would reflect the old non-Lindeman variant, as in Vedic diam and so on, that just happens to survive in this form beside die. But this seems unlikely, with one possible exception, which I'll come back to a bit later. There's no trace of an old accusative diem, as opposed to the widespread die in both Latin and Sibyllic. So why would die survive only, or survive best, in this derived form diekelo? The only explicit account that I know of is due to Rix, who comments on diakilo as opposed to theonyms like those mentioned in handout 6, the Umbrian vocative D from DA and so on, commenting as in 14, where he says that the longer word form has selected the phonetically shorter variant of the base form, while the shorter word form of the theonyms calls for the phonetically longer variant DA. Well, this is a pleasantly symmetrical description that he offers without any further elaboration, but I'd like to ask what underlies this sort of statement. And my suggestion is simply that this is nothing other than what we might well call Lindeman's law, the regular alternation between monosyllables with certain root structures that contain so-called Lindemann variants, and longer forms that exclude this kind of variation, except secondarily, as in classic cases like those listed in handout 16. Well-known instances like Vedic diaus and diaus, but diava, purtivi, and so on. Notice that some of these do have analogically imported disyllabic versions in first compound members, as in the words for 12 in both Vedic and Greek. So Greek duo, but dodeca, and analogically duodeca as well. So for italic with simplex or unsuffixed die, unattested or virtually unattested, we have da beside diakelo and analogical diakelo, which is essentially like Greek duo, duo beside dodeca and analogical duodeca, as an italic vestige, or maybe analog, if one prefers, of Lindemann's law. There is, as I mentioned, marginal evidence for a simplex da, and this appears, or may appear, in the Messapic word Zeus, meaning Zeus, if, as Rix assumes, this was borrowed from South Oscan, and therefore might apply old dies, presumably based on an accusative diem. In that case, italic would be more like Vedic than Greek, with both die and da, but only diakelo. If this feature of Lindemann's law survives at least vestigially in italic, it could in theory operate on new formations, that is, not just on inherited material. But this leads to a question about the age of the formation diakelo itself, which I'll just say something about very briefly. Kelo, as a suffix, which is productive in Latin as a diminutive suffix and well attested in Sabellic, is usually thought to be an italic innovation via so-called suffix Häufung, built on ko plus lo. But this is something that may be documented as far back as the oldest Faliscan we have, as in handout 21, which is about the oldest italic of any kind that we have. And moreover, David Sasseville has recently suggested that the same suffix may appear in Luvian as in the forms in 22. So perhaps diakelo is quite old within italic. Are there other examples of this sort of alternation that I'm suggesting for diakelo as opposed to da forms? The answer is not yet, that I've been able to find so far. Maybe not surprisingly, there is after all very limited evidence of Lindemann alternations in italic anyway, as well as surveyed briefly in handout 24. The closest I've been able to come is Latin bimus, 2 years old, literally having 2 winters. Traditionally, traditionally based on the preform given in handout 29 with the perfectly good Vedic comparandum. And I stress that this is perfectly fine. I'm not disputing the attractiveness of this interpretation, but in theory, as in 26, we might have a simplex Lindeman form, he aims winter, beside a formation like due giamo, which would recover the type of pattern I'm suggesting for die kilo. Let me now turn to the second set of forms in question, and that is Faliscan foyed beside Latin hodie. Both words consist of a pronominal element, more on that a bit later, plus a form of the word for day, die. So we have die in Faliscan and die in Latin. Let's skip over 28 in the interest of time. It's not important for the argument, and go ahead to 29. The relationship between die in Faliscan and die in Latin is what we're interested in. It's often been asserted that Latin hodie has a restored d based on dies, at least implying that Faliscan shows an older or more original version. But again, what accounts for die as opposed to the die otherwise found in Italic, apart from die kilo? Again, this is all but ignored in Latin or Italic handbooks. Neumann, though, did say something about this, as in handout 31. He suggests that what we have is a remodeled inherited word to which he compares Vedic adya. This is actually an old and rather popular idea, but I find this difficult to accept. There really is not much correspondence between adya and these words beyond the sequence di yod. For one thing, the anaphoric pronoun stem at the beginning of adya is nothing like the demonstrative that we have in the Italic forms. A demonstrative form that is not likely actually to be used as a first compound number or a prefix anyway, more on that in a minute. And whatever the background of the Vedic word, which actually has alternation between short a and long a in the final syllable, it seems difficult to me to separate the da and da of Faliscan and Latin from the Italic long e form for day, da, as opposed to the plain sort of minimal version of the root that we have in Vedic adya. There is also an updated version of this theory offered by George Dunkel in his Handbook of Particles, where adya, but notice actually adya with long a only and not adya with short a is said to be essentially an exact cognate of Faliscan foyed and Latin hodie based on the three particle sequence as in handout 32. The prefix belongs to, the particle that's identified in the first part of 32, but in Italic, the oye that should come out of this has been remodeled after the ho of the near-deictic pronoun stem used in Latin and Faliscan, and the d again has been restored in Latin. This, I think, is no better and maybe worse. I think the remodeling of Italic oye to hoye is not credible. This also requires an unattractive separation of the two Vedic forms, adya and adya, will have to come from different sources. And again, as with what we saw from Neumann, we have an unattractive separation of the Faliscan Latin form da or da from the Italic word for day. So in Italic, I think that these forms are best interpreted to my way of thinking anyway, as having the near-deictic pronoun in the first part of the word, as traditionally. But an important consequence of this is that the word is not actually a compound. Rather, it's a univerbation, since this pronoun, which is not inherited as such, is virtually unattested as a first compound member. The only other two descriptive compounds that we have are mentioned in 35. So these forms, Latin horno, this year, and horsum in this direction, are not, again, necessarily really compounds. Again, they could well be original univerbations as well. As for the case form of this pronoun in the original version of the phrase for today, there are actually two different proposals, as in handout 36, one based on a locative, one based on an ablative. But this question can actually be left aside for our purposes. The main point here is the univerbation, which trivially allows for phonological reduction via syncopes, as has actually happened in at least one other word for a word involving the day word, kotidie. You can call this haplology instead of syncope if you like, but the point is not effective. So I assume that the original form of the phrase had die and not die. Thus, for the reduction of die to die and for this one foyer, I think there's perhaps more than one possibility. We could consider this to be another example of the Lindeman effect that I was arguing for in diekelo, operating on the univerbated sequence of the pronoun stem ho plus diade. Or we could simply have a phonological reduction of diade, showing a syncope that is consequent on the univerbation. As a factor, we might also point to the possibility of a strong initial stress in Faliscan, which could also have helped condition a syncope. In any event, the diade to die reduction must have occurred at a very early stage before the treatment of die to geminate glide that we see on the surface in the Faliscan form. Finally, as for Latin hodie, in theory, it might not have undergone the phonological reduction and so could continue the older die form, but on balance, probably it's better to assume a unitary development with Faliscan and a secondary adjustment after dies, as traditionally, though I would say with a different starting point and in a more complex sequence of events than the traditional conception, as in the sample derivations in handout 40, using the ablative option for the pronoun, so starting with the original phrase, which would thus have had two accents, then univerbated with one accent leading to reductions, then the treatment of the dental plus the glide, essentially leading directly to Faliscan foyer, plus shortening and restoration that has to be assumed for Latin hodie. Thank you.
I just have a question. I don't remember Riks's paper in Rasmussen's Fashionist. So do we know enough about Misatic to be sure that this form, this, has to be a loan word from Oscar?
The short answer probably is no. But one thing that could be said has to do with the development of long E in Misatic. So long E in Misatic may have two other treatments. So one is E, as in a probable aorist form like hypodes, or I think that's the right form, hypodes. So des from root aorist of dech. There is a possibility that there is a prohibitive particle which comes out as ma, so A could be another treatment of long E. So this would be a third treatment of long E. This is a point that Rix makes, and this treatment you can at least deal with by saying that it comes from Oscan. So that's about as close as we can come, I think, to any kind of certainty about the likelihood of this being an Oscan alone.
Thank you. See, yeah, Brent, on the very last line of the handout,
yes.
Do you have any guidance for us on the nature of that shortening that we're getting there?
Well, this is something I skipped over back in number 36. So this is the type of shortening that's often referred to as shortening through enclisis. It's the type that's quite widespread in Plautine forms like sequidem, tuquidem, and so on, and is often thought to have operated in hodie as well. That process itself, as you know, is difficult. It's not totally clear whether it's just a purely metrical thing, or whether there is something, some sort of phonological basis that makes it a broader type of phenomenon. So that's a separate problem, and it is a problem. So,
okay, I was just wondering whether you had any new bright light to shine.
Well,
on
I actually was looking at this recently in connection with another word that's in a way related to all this, which is Latin edipol, where the de of edipol, I think, is as sometimes claimed, the old vocative of deivos. And so we'll have to get a shortening of that as well. And so I think that would be a pretty good example of the operation of this process. When I gave that paper recently, there was a comment about this shortening from Kanehiro Nishimura, and I think that maybe he has a very promising idea, which is that this may be something that has to do with syllabic footing. So as a kind of metrical thing, there may be ways to account for this based on alternations of heavy and light syllables, and maybe connections between that and the accent. So at least he has some new ideas about this, and they may be a little bit promising.
Trochaic short?
Yeah, essentially something like that. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great, thanks.
I just have a very brief question, and that is that I'm just thinking through this as you're talking. You had the restoration of the D in the today word, and I'm just comparing this to other words for today that we find in Indo-European. Like the first thing that comes to mind is hoita, and Old High German hutagu, and even Sanskrit adya. I mean, did they really? They probably didn't parse that as having the day word. So the question is, do you think that the word, the D word, would really get restored in such a form? In other words, the form having been relexicalized in a certain kind of way as a unity, do you really think they would have reconstituted the compound?
Well, I think that would vary from language to language. Yeah. So I think in Latin it seems likely to me, partly because of the special inflectional behavior of dies. So if you have a form like this that has a long E as the stem, and even in the early stages an ablative looking D, and it means something having to do with day, then that seems quite likely to me. Other languages, well, maybe different. Yeah. Adya, I don't know. I mean, there was also sadyas in Sanskrit, a little series of these forms. But in that case, it's just the dia part, so hard to say.
Thank you, Brent. Okay, so we will reconvene at 2 o'clock here.
Can we leave our
No. Hold on a sec. No, I don't have the key. I can't lock this room here, so take your stuff. I can't lock this room. Yeah. So please take your stuff with you.